What if everything you thought you knew about family, loyalty, and inheritance was about to shatter in a single afternoon? The grand library of Whitmore Manor stood silent, except for the ticking of an ancient grandfather clock, its mahogany shelves lined with leather-bound books that had witnessed generations of family secrets. Sunlight filtered through floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long shadows across the Persian rug where Henry Whitmore's family gathered, their designer clothes and expensive jewelry glinting like armor prepared for battle. Clara stood in the corner, her simple black dress a stark contrast to the opulence surrounding her, hands clasped tightly as she tried to make herself invisible among the portraits of stern-faced Whitmore ancestors judging from gilded frames. Edmund Cross, the family lawyer, sat behind Henry's massive oak desk, a thick manila envelope before him, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses. The air felt thick with anticipation, with greed barely concealed behind practiced expressions of grief. Though Henry had been dead only 3 days, and not a single tear had been shed at his funeral. Victoria Whitmore sat rigid in a velvet armchair, her perfectly manicured nails drumming an impatient rhythm, while her brother Marcus paced near the fireplace, checking his Rolex every 30 seconds as though time itself was another asset to be claimed. Isabel scrolled through her phone, already mentally redecorating the mansion for her Instagram followers, and Sebastian leaned against a bookshelf, that familiar arrogant smirk playing at his lips as he calculated his share of the billions. Mrs. Pemberton, the head housekeeper, stood near Clara, her stern face softening momentarily as she squeezed the younger woman's hand, a gesture of solidarity that did not go unnoticed by the hungry eyes in the room. Edmund cleared his throat, the sound cutting through the tension like a knife, and every head turned toward him with predatory focus. "Thank you all for gathering," he began, his voice carrying the weight of decades serving the Whitmore family. "I know these past days have been difficult, though I suspect what I'm about to read will prove even more challenging." Marcus stopped pacing, Victoria's drumming ceased, and even Isabel looked up from her phone as Edmund broke the seal on the envelope with deliberate slowness that seemed designed to torture them. The lawyer pulled out several thick documents, his eyes scanning the first page before lifting to meet the expectant faces, and Clara noticed something in his expression that made her stomach twist with unexplained anxiety. "Henry Whitmore's last will and testament," Edmund announced, "dated 6 weeks ago and witnessed by myself and Dr. Morrison, declares the following distribution of assets." The room held its collective breath, a moment suspended in time where possibilities still existed and dreams of wealth remained intact. "To my daughter Victoria, I leave €1,000,000 and the cottage in Provence," Edmund read, his voice steady despite Victoria's sharp intake of breath that sounded like a wounded animal. "To my son Marcus, I leave €1,000,000 and my collection of vintage automobiles." Marcus's face turned crimson, a vein pulsing visibly at his temple as his hands clenched into fists that shook with barely contained rage. "To my grandchildren Isabel and Sebastian, I leave €500,000 each, to be held in trust until they demonstrate actual employment for a minimum of 2 consecutive years." Isabel's phone clattered to the floor, her mouth falling open in disbelief, while Sebastian's smirk vanished, replaced by a mask of cold fury. Edmund paused, taking a deep breath before continuing, and Clara felt every eye in the room suddenly shift toward her with an intensity that made her want to disappear into the wallpaper. "The remainder of my estate, including Whitmore Manor, all associated properties, business holdings, investment portfolios, and liquid assets totaling approximately €800 million, I leave entirely and without condition to Clara Bennett, née Morrison, in recognition of her unwavering loyalty, integrity, and the genuine kindness she has shown me in my final years." The words hung in the air like a grenade with the pin pulled, the silence that followed more deafening than any explosion could be. Clara's knees buckled, and only Mrs. Pemberton's quick reaction kept her from collapsing to the floor, the room spinning as she processed words that couldn't possibly be real. "This is absurd." Victoria's voice shattered the silence, rising to a shriek as she shot from her chair like a missile launched from decades of entitlement. "That little gold digger manipulated him, seduced him, probably poisoned his mind with God knows what drugs or witchcraft." Marcus advanced on Edmund's desk, his face now purple with apoplectic rage, jabbing a finger at the lawyer as spittle flew from his mouth. "My father was clearly not of sound mind when he wrote this travesty, and I'll have every lawyer in Europe tear this document apart until there's nothing left but confetti." Sebastian pushed off from the bookshelf, his voice dripping with venom as he pointed at Clara with accusatory precision. She's a con artist, a parasite who wormed her way into an old man's delusions, and I swear on everything holy that she won't see a single euro of what's rightfully ours." Isabel began crying, though Clara suspected the tears were more theatrical than genuine, her voice climbing to a hysterical pitch. "Grandfather always said family came first, always, and now this nobody, this servant, gets everything while his own blood gets scraps like we're beggars." Clara found her voice finally, though it came out as barely more than a whisper that somehow cut through the chaos. "I never asked for this. I never wanted anything except to do my job and take care of him. You have to believe me." But her words fell on ears deafened by greed and fury, the Whitmore family circling like sharks who'd scented blood in the water. Edmund stood, his voice carrying an authority that momentarily quelled the storm, his hand raised for silence that came grudgingly and with murderous glares. "Henry Whitmore was of completely sound mind when he executed this will. I can personally attest to that, as can Dr. Morrison, who performed a full cognitive evaluation specifically for this purpose." He pulled another document from the envelope, holding it up like a shield against their accusations. Furthermore, he left this sealed letter to be read aloud in the event of exactly this reaction, which he predicted with unfortunate accuracy. The lawyer's hands steady now with purpose, he broke the seal on a cream-colored envelope bearing Henry's distinctive handwriting, the sight of it causing Victoria to sob with what might have been actual emotion. "My dearest family," Edmund read in Henry's words from beyond the grave. "If you're hearing this, then Edmund has just informed you of my final wishes, and I imagine you're ready to tear both him and Clara apart with your bare hands." A bitter laugh escaped Marcus despite himself, the accuracy of the predictions somehow making everything worse. "I want you to understand that I made this decision with absolute clarity of mind and purpose, after watching each of you for 78 years and finding you all wanting in the qualities that actually matter in this world." The words cut deeper than any knife could, the truth of them more painful than the loss of money. "Clara never asked me for anything, never tried to manipulate or flatter me, never saw me as a walking bank account waiting to be accessed, and that alone made her more deserving than any of you could ever understand." Edmund's voice wavered slightly, emotion bleeding through his professional composure. "She saw me as a human being, brought me tea when I was tired, laughed at my terrible jokes, and treated me with the simple dignity that you all forgot I deserved the moment I became valuable." Victoria was crying openly now, though whether from grief or rage remained unclear even to herself. "So yes, I leave everything to Clara, and I do so knowing it will enrage you, hoping perhaps that this final lesson might teach you something about what truly matters, though I suspect even death cannot cure willful blindness." The letter concluded with a flourish that was pure Henry Whitmore. "Contest the will if you must, waste your inheritances on lawyers who will gladly take your money while telling you what you want to hear. But know this, I've built legal walls around this decision that would take decades and fortunes to breach, and Clara deserves every penny more than any of you ever did." Edmund folded the letter carefully, his eyes meeting Clara's with something like pity mixed with respect, while the Whitmore family stood frozen in various stages of shock and fury. The grandfather clock chimed 5 times, marking the moment when everything changed forever, when a humble maid became one of the wealthiest women in Europe and a family's greed finally faced consequences. But as Clara looked at the hatred burning in the eyes surrounding her, she realized that inheriting Henry's fortune might be the easy part. What came next, surviving the war that was about to begin, that would test everything she thought she knew about strength, courage, and the true cost of sudden wealth. Could she possibly navigate the treacherous waters ahead, protect her marriage, and honor Henry's trust without losing herself in the process? Clara sat alone in her small attic room that night, the same cramped space she'd occupied for 5 years, surrounded by the same modest possessions that suddenly seemed absurdly inadequate for a woman who now owned an €800 million empire. The reading had ended with Victoria's threat of legal action echoing through the halls, Marcus literally overturning a chair in his rage, and Sebastian's parting words promising that Clara would pay for this travesty in ways she couldn't imagine. Mrs. Pemberton had escorted her upstairs through service corridors to avoid the family, her protective instincts activated by decades of watching the Whitmores destroy anything they perceived as threatening their privilege. Now Clara sat on her narrow bed, Henry's leather-bound journal in her trembling hands, the one he'd pressed into her palm 3 days before his death with instructions to read it only after the will was revealed. The journal's cover was worn smooth by years of handling, its pages filled with Henry's precise handwriting documenting not just business dealings, but observations about his family that grew increasingly bitter with each passing year. September 12th, Clara read aloud to the empty room, her voice barely steady. Victoria visited today, the first time in 8 months, and within 10 minutes asked about updating my will to ensure proper family succession. As though I'm too senile to see through her transparent greed. The entries painted a devastating portrait of a man who'd built an empire only to watch his own flesh and blood become parasites feeding on his success. Henry had documented every slight, every mercenary visit, every grandchild who called only when they needed money, every child who saw him as an obstacle to their inheritance rather than a father. March 3rd, another entry read, Sebastian lost $200,000 at the casino again, came begging for a bailout, promised this was the last time. The same lie I've heard 17 times now, and when I refused, he actually said he hoped I'd die soon so he could access his money, apparently forgetting I was standing right there. Clara's heart ached for the loneliness bleeding through every page, the isolation of a man surrounded by family, yet completely alone. A soft knock interrupted her reading, and Thomas entered carrying a tray with tea and sandwiches that Mrs. Pemberton had sent up, his kind face creased with concern as he set it on her small desk. "You haven't eaten since breakfast," he said gently, sitting beside her on the bed and taking her hand in his calloused one, the simple touch grounding her in reality. "I still can't believe it," Clara whispered, leaning into her husband's solid warmth. 800 million euros, Thomas. That's not real money. That's the kind of number you see in movies about fictional billionaires. Thomas wrapped an arm around her shoulders, his carpenter's strength reassuring, even as his own mind struggled to process their new reality. Henry must have had his reasons, and from what Edmund said, they were documented reasons that won't be easily dismissed in court, so maybe we should trust that he knew what he was doing. But Clara shook her head, pulling away to pace the small room like a caged animal suddenly aware of the bars. "You didn't see their faces, Thomas, the pure hatred, especially Sebastian's. He looked at me like he wanted to wrap his hands around my throat and squeeze until I stopped breathing." Her husband stood, catching her hands to stop the pacing, forcing her to meet his steady gaze. "Then we'll be careful, we'll hire security if necessary, but we won't let their anger dictate how we live our lives or make us feel guilty for something we didn't orchestrate." A louder knock, more aggressive this time, announced Edmund Cross's arrival, the lawyer looking exhausted as he entered with a briefcase full of documents that represented Clara's new reality. "I apologize for the intrusion," he began, settling into the room's only chair with a weariness that suggested this day had aged him considerably. "But there are urgent matters we need to discuss before the vultures begin their legal assault." Clara and Thomas sat back on the bed, hands joined, presenting a united front against whatever came next. "First, the good news," Edmund continued, pulling out a thick folder. Henry's legal preparations were extraordinarily thorough. He spent the last 3 years building an impenetrable fortress around this will with the help of Europe's finest estate attorneys. He laid out documents showing psychiatric evaluations, video recordings of Henry discussing his decision-making process, and affidavits from doctors confirming his complete mental competence. He knew exactly what he was doing and took every precaution to ensure his wishes couldn't be easily contested, though that won't stop the family from trying. Clara felt a strange mix of gratitude and sorrow that Henry had spent his final years preparing for this battle rather than enjoying what little time remained. "The challenging news," Edmund's expression darkened, "is that Victoria has already retained Blackstone and Associates, the most aggressive litigation firm in London, and they've filed for an emergency injunction to freeze the estate pending investigation." Thomas tensed beside her, his protective instincts activated. "What does that mean practically?" "It means that for now, until a judge reviews the will and circumstances, you can't access the majority of the funds or make any significant decisions regarding the properties," Edmund explained, though his tone suggested this was expected. However, Henry anticipated this move and established a separate trust account with 10 million euros specifically for your immediate needs and legal defense, accessible immediately. 10 million euros for immediate needs was a phrase so absurd that Clara almost laughed, except nothing about this situation was remotely funny. "How long will the legal battle take?" she asked, dreading the answer. Edmund sighed, removing his glasses to rub his tired eyes. "Conservatively, 6 months to a year, though if they're particularly determined and well-funded it could stretch to 2 or 3 years of constant litigation." The thought of years fighting Henry's family, while living in this impossible situation, made Clara want to crawl under the bed and hide until the nightmare ended. "There's something else," Edmund's voice took on a cautionary tone. "The family is already spreading rumors through their social circles, accusing you of manipulation, seduction, even potential elder abuse, and I expect these accusations to intensify." Thomas's jaw clenched, anger flashing in his kind eyes. "She did nothing wrong. Nothing except treat an old man with basic human decency. How dare they?" "Unfortunately, how dare they isn't a legal defense," Edmund replied grimly. "And their strategy will be to destroy Clara's reputation so thoroughly that even if we win in court, she loses in public opinion." Clara stood, walking to her small window that overlooked the estate's gardens where she'd spent countless hours helping the groundskeeper plant roses that Henry loved. "So what do we do?" she asked, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of amber and gold. "We fight," Edmund declared with sudden fierceness. "We honor Henry's wishes by refusing to let his selfish children and grandchildren bully us into submission, and we use every legal tool at our disposal to prove that this will represent his true desires." Thomas joined Clara at the window, his reflection in the glass showing determination replacing shock. "And personally?" he asked, the question hanging heavy in the air. "Personally," Edmund stood, gathering his documents. "You stay vigilant, document everything, trust no one from the Whitmore family, and prepare for this situation to get worse before it gets better." After Edmund left, Clara and Thomas stood together in silence, watching night fall over the estate that was now somehow theirs but also somehow not. "We could walk away," Thomas said softly, voicing the thought they'd both been avoiding. "Refuse the inheritance. Give them what they want. Go back to our simple life." Clara considered this, genuinely considered it, the appeal of returning to anonymity and safety almost overwhelming. But then she thought of Henry, alone in his final days, trusting her with this impossible gift, believing she had the strength to honor his legacy and show his family that wealth without character means nothing. "No," she said finally, her voice growing stronger. "Henry chose me for a reason, even if I don't fully understand it yet, and walking away would dishonor his memory and prove them right about me being weak." Thomas smiled, the expression filling his honest face with pride. "Then we stay and fight?" "We stay and fight," Clara confirmed, though the words felt like signing a declaration of war. A sudden crash from somewhere below made them both jump, followed by raised voices and what sounded like furniture being thrown against walls. Thomas moved toward the door, protective instincts overriding caution. "Stay here," he commanded, but Clara grabbed his arm. "No, if they're destroying the house, I need to see it. I'm responsible for this property now, whether they like it or not." They descended the service stairs together, following the sounds of chaos to the main drawing room, where Sebastian and Marcus were systematically destroying everything they could reach. Priceless vases shattered against walls, paintings were ripped from their hooks, and furniture overturned with vicious satisfaction. "Stop this immediately." Clara's voice rang out with an authority she didn't know she possessed, the command freezing both men mid-destruction. Sebastian wheeled on her, his face twisted with alcohol-fueled rage, a bottle of Henry's finest scotch dangling from one hand. "Look who decided to inspect her new property," he sneered, advancing with predatory intent. "The little maid who thinks she's a queen now." Marcus blocked the doorway, his bulk intimidating, his expression cold and calculating. "You know what happens to people who steal from the Whitmore family?" he asked conversationally, as though discussing the weather. "They disappear, quietly, efficiently, and no one ever asks questions because we have the money and connections to make problems vanish." Thomas stepped in front of Clara, his carpenter's frame suddenly seeming larger, more dangerous. "Touch my wife, and you'll discover that not everyone is intimidated by your family name or your threats." The standoff lasted an eternal moment, tension thick enough to choke on, until Mrs. Pemberton appeared with 2 security guards that Edmund had apparently hired before leaving. "Gentlemen," the head housekeeper's voice could have frozen fire, "you have 30 seconds to leave this property voluntarily before you're removed by force and banned from returning." Sebastian laughed, a harsh sound devoid of humor. "This is my grandfather's house, my house, and some jumped-up maid and her peasant husband don't get to tell me where I can go." But the security guards, both former military by their bearing, moved forward with professional efficiency. "Your 30 seconds are up," one announced flatly. The removal was neither gentle nor dignified. Sebastian and Marcus both physically escorted from the property while hurling threats and obscenities that echoed through the grand halls. Clara surveyed the damage to the drawing room, her heart breaking at the senseless destruction of beautiful things that Henry had collected over decades. "This is just the beginning, isn't it?" she asked Mrs. Pemberton, who was already calling housekeeping staff to begin cleanup. "Yes, dear," the older woman replied with weary wisdom. "But you're stronger than you know, and you're not alone in this fight." As they worked together to restore order to the chaos, Clara realized that Henry's gift came with a cost she was only beginning to understand. The money was one thing, but the responsibility, the target on her back, the constant warfare with people who would stop at nothing to reclaim what they believed was rightfully theirs, that was something else entirely. Later, back in their attic room, Clara opened Henry's journal to the final entry, dated the day before his death. "If you're reading this, Clara, then you know now what I've done and why." Henry's words seemed to speak directly to her soul. "And you're probably terrified, probably wanting to run, probably wondering if I was cruel to burden you with this impossible situation." She wiped away tears that blurred the handwriting. "But I chose you because I saw in you something my family lost generations ago. The understanding that money is a tool, not a god, that character matters more than wealth, and that true strength isn't measured in bank accounts, but in the courage to do what's right even when it's difficult." The entry concluded with instructions. "Fight them, Clara, not with their weapons of greed and manipulation, but with integrity, intelligence, and the simple determination to prove that goodness can triumph over entitlement, and in doing so, maybe, just maybe, you'll teach my family the lesson I never could." Thomas read over her shoulder, his hand finding hers in the darkness. "Can we do this?" Clara closed the journal, her resolve hardening like steel forged in fire. "We have to try." But as she drifted towards sleep, one question haunted her dreams. What secrets had Henry discovered about his family that made him so determined to disinherit them? And what would happen when those secrets inevitably came to light? Want to know what explosive family secrets Henry uncovered that made him distrust his heirs so completely? Drop a comment below sharing what you would do if you suddenly inherited a fortune from someone you barely expected it from. Would you fight for it or walk away? Your answer might surprise you. And don't forget to like this video and subscribe. Clara woke to hammering on her door at 6 in the morning, 3 days after the catastrophic reading, her exhausted mind taking several seconds to separate dream from reality as the pounding continued with aggressive insistence. Thomas bolted upright beside her, immediately alert, his protective instincts switching on like a floodlight as he grabbed the cricket bat he'd started keeping by the bed since the drawing room incident. "Mrs. Bennet, it's Detective James Hartley from the Metropolitan Police. I need to speak with you immediately regarding Henry Whitmore's death," a gruff voice announced through the wooden barrier, sending ice water through Clara's veins. Thomas opened the door cautiously, revealing a weathered man in his mid-40s with observant gray eyes that seemed to catalog everything in a single sweep, his rumpled suit and 5 o'clock shadow suggesting he'd been working through the night. "Detective, is there a problem?" Thomas asked, positioning himself between the officer and his wife, though Hartley's expression suggested this was a conversation that couldn't be avoided or delayed. The detective held up his identification, the badge catching the early morning light streaming through the attic window. "Victoria Whitmore filed a formal complaint yesterday alleging that her father's death may not have been natural, specifically suggesting that someone with access to his private quarters and medications may have hastened his demise." The accusation hung in the air like poison gas, and Clara felt her world tilt dangerously on its axis. "That's insane," she breathed, the words barely audible. "Henry died of heart failure. Dr. Morrison was with him. There were witnesses. How can they possibly suggest otherwise?" Hartley's expression remained neutral, professionally detached. "Nevertheless, the complaint has been filed, and given the circumstances of the will and the substantial inheritance involved, my superiors felt an investigation was warranted. So I'm here to ask you some questions and examine Mr. Whitmore's private quarters." Thomas moved to object, but Clara placed a hand on his arm, her mind racing through implications. "Of course, detective, I have nothing to hide. Ask whatever you need to ask, and I'll show you Henry's rooms personally." Mrs. Pemberton appeared in the doorway, already dressed despite the early hour, her stern face registering disapproval at the entire situation. "I'll prepare tea in the morning room while you conduct your investigation, detective, and I should mention that I was also present when Mr. Whitmore passed and can attest to the natural progression of his illness." Hartley nodded acknowledgement, but his attention remained fixed on Clara with the intensity of someone trained to spot lies and evasions. "When did you last see Henry Whitmore alive, Mrs. Bennet?" Clara wrapped her robe tighter, willing her voice to remain steady despite the fear coursing through her. The evening before he died, around 9 o'clock, I brought him his evening medication and some chamomile tea. We talked for about 20 minutes about the roses in the garden, and then I helped him settle for the night. The detective made notes in a small leather notebook, his pen scratching across pages already filled with observations. And the medication you brought him, where did you obtain it? From Dr. Morrison directly, the same as always, Clara explained, feeling like every word was a potential trap. The doctor prepared his doses in a weekly organizer. I simply delivered them at the prescribed times along with water or tea. Thomas interjected, his voice tight with controlled anger. My wife followed the same routine she'd maintained for 2 years, under direct supervision of medical professionals. Suggesting anything improper is absurd and slanderous. Hartley's gaze shifted to the carpenter, measuring, assessing. I'm not suggesting anything, Mr. Bennett. I'm investigating a complaint, which is my job. Now shall we examine Mr. Whitmore's quarters? Clara led the detective through the mansion's silent corridors, past portraits of disapproving ancestors, down the west wing to Henry's private suite that she'd cleaned and maintained for 5 years, but now felt like entering sacred, forbidden territory. The rooms remained exactly as Henry left them, his reading glasses still on the nightstand beside a biography of Churchill, his slippers positioned neatly by the bed, the faint scent of his cologne lingering in the air like a ghost refusing to depart. Hartley moved through the space with methodical precision, examining medicine bottles, checking dates, photographing labels, his trained eyes missing nothing as Clara stood in the doorway feeling like an intruder in a dead man's sanctuary. The family claims you spent an unusual amount of time alone with Mr. Whitmore in his final months, the detective stated. Not quite an accusation, but not quite a question either, the implication clear. Henry was lonely, Clara replied, her voice breaking slightly. His family visited rarely and only when they wanted something. So yes, I spent time with him, talking, reading aloud, playing chess, treating him like a human being instead of a bank account. Is that somehow suspicious? Hartley paused in his examination of Henry's desk, something in Clara's tone apparently resonating. Actually, no, it's not suspicious, it's decent, which, based on the family members I've interviewed this morning, is a quality in remarkably short supply among the Whitmores. He pulled open desk drawers with gloved hands, sifting through papers and correspondence with practiced efficiency. Sebastian Whitmore suggested you seduced his grandfather. Isabel claimed you isolated him from family. Marcus insinuated you forged the will, and Victoria practically demanded I arrest you immediately. Quite the coordinated assault. Clara sank into Henry's favorite armchair, the leather still molded to his shape, overwhelmed by the relentless attacks. I loved Henry like family, like the grandfather I never had, and I could never harm him. Surely Dr. Morrison's records prove his death was expected and natural? Dr. Morrison's records are impeccable, Hartley confirmed, closing the desk drawers. Which is why I suspect this investigation will conclude with no evidence of wrongdoing, but procedure requires thoroughness, especially with this much money involved. The detective moved to Henry's walk-in closet, examining shelves of precisely organized clothing, and then paused, his attention caught by something Clara had never noticed in 5 years of cleaning. Mrs. Bennett, did you know there's a safe concealed behind this panel? Clara stood, moving to where Hartley indicated a section of mahogany paneling that looked identical to everything surrounding it except for an almost imperceptible seam running vertically. I had no idea, she admitted, running her fingers along the edge, feeling the slight gap. Henry never mentioned a safe, at least not to me. Hartley pressed along the panel's edge, and with a soft click, it swung open to reveal a substantial steel safe embedded in the wall, its digital keypad blinking with a red locked indicator. This could contain important estate documents, financial records, perhaps even information relevant to his decision-making regarding the will, the detective mused, clearly intrigued despite himself. Do you know the combination? Clara shook her head, but then remembered the journal, specifically the final page where Henry had written a seemingly random series of numbers she'd assumed were dates. Wait, there might be something, she said, pulling the leather journal from her robe pocket where she'd started carrying it like a talisman, flipping to the back page. Henry wrote these numbers here, 07182025. I thought they were dates, but maybe? Hartley took the journal carefully, examining the numbers, then turned to the safe's keypad. July 18th, 2025, that's 3 months ago. Significant? That's the day Clara married me. Thomas said quietly from the doorway where he'd been standing sentinel. "We had a small ceremony in the village church. Henry sent us a generous gift but didn't attend because he wasn't feeling well." The detective entered the numbers, and the safe released with a mechanical hiss that seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet room, the heavy door swinging open to reveal contents that made everyone freeze. Inside weren't just documents but evidence of secrets, stacks of photographs, old newspaper clippings yellowed with age, letters bound with string, and a modern external hard drive labeled insurance, in Henry's distinctive handwriting. Hartley pulled on gloves before carefully removing items, laying them on Henry's desk with reverent precision, as though handling archaeological artifacts. The photographs were shocking, images spanning decades showing various Whitmore family members in compromising situations. Victoria accepting an envelope from a man later identified in clippings as a corrupt city official. Marcus meeting with individuals connected to money laundering operations. Sebastian at illegal gambling establishments with known criminals. "Jesus Christ," Hartley breathed, his professional detachment cracking as he sifted through documentation of fraud, bribery, tax evasion, and assorted criminality spanning 30 years. Henry Whitmore was building a case against his own family. Clara picked up a letter dated 15 years earlier, reading Henry's words to someone named Catherine. "I've discovered Victoria's involvement in the planning scandal, millions in bribes changing hands while low-income families lost their homes. And she's my daughter, but I can't protect her from this. I won't, though confronting her means destroying what's left of our relationship." Thomas examined photographs of Sebastian with bruised knuckles, standing over someone bleeding on the ground. Newspaper clippings about an assault case that was mysteriously dropped. He knew everything they'd done and documented it all, but never turned them in. Why? Because they were his family, Clara understood suddenly, tears streaming down her face as Henry's isolation became painfully clear. He couldn't love them, but he couldn't destroy them either, so he just watched and recorded and died a little inside with each betrayal. Hartley connected the external hard drive to his laptop, accessing files that contained decades of financial records, encrypted communications, video recordings of conversations where family members discussed illegal activities, apparently unaware they were being monitored. "This is enough evidence to bring criminal charges against the entire family," the detective said, his voice filled with something between awe and horror. "Fraud, embezzlement, conspiracy, bribery, assault. The statute of limitations has passed on some of this, but not all. Why didn't he ever use it?" Clara found another letter, this one dated just 6 months ago, addressed "To whom it may concern," in Henry's shaky late-life handwriting. "I've spent 30 years documenting my family's crimes, not to punish them, but to understand how the children I raised could become such morally bankrupt individuals," she read aloud, her voice trembling. "I've concluded that wealth without accountability breeds entitlement, entitlement breeds contempt for rules, and contempt breeds criminality, which is why I'm leaving everything to Clara, who understands that money is responsibility, not permission." The letter continued with devastating clarity. "Should my family contest the will, as I know they will, I authorize the executor to release these documents to authorities and media as proof of why they deserve nothing. Let the world see what they really are. Let them face consequences I was too weak to impose, and let Clara inherit an empire no longer tainted by their corruption." Hartley sat back, removing his gloves, his expression complex. "So he was protecting you with this, ensuring that if they attacked legally, they'd trigger their own destruction. That's either brilliant or ruthless, possibly both." Thomas moved to Clara's side, reading over her shoulder, his face pale. "This changes everything, doesn't it?" "Completely," the detective confirmed, photographing documents with methodical efficiency. Victoria's complaint about suspicious death just became significantly less credible given that prosecution for fraud would be her consequence for pressing the issue. And I suspect once Edmund Cross reveals this evidence exists, the family's legal challenges will evaporate rather quickly. Clara felt sick, not with relief but with the weight of what Henry had carried alone for decades. He loved them despite everything. That's why this hurt him so much. He kept hoping they'd change, become better people, and they just kept disappointing him. She picked up a photograph from 20 years earlier showing a younger Henry with his family at some formal event. Everyone smiling for the camera, and only Henry's eyes revealing the sadness beneath. "What happens now?" Thomas asked the question. Hanging over everyone. Hartley began carefully packing evidence into containers, his movements precise. "Now I complete my investigation, which based on Dr. Morrison's records and the obvious natural progression of heart disease, will conclude that Henry Whitmore died of natural causes. and I file a report noting the existence of this safe and its contents, which becomes part of the estate record accessible to Edmund Cross. He turned to Clara, his expression softening slightly. And you, Mrs. Bennet, should prepare for the family's legal assault to collapse rather spectacularly once they realize continuing means criminal prosecution. Henry Whitmore played a long game, and even from the grave, he's protecting you. After Hartley left with his evidence containers, Clara and Thomas stood in Henry's bedroom, surrounded by the remnants of a life spent watching loved ones betray everything he valued. I don't want their money if this is the cost, Clara whispered. All this pain, all this betrayal, how can I enjoy wealth built on so much family destruction? Thomas held her close, his solid presence anchoring her to reality. Henry didn't want you to enjoy it, he wanted you to use it better than they would have. To prove that good people can handle wealth without losing their souls, that's the real inheritance, the responsibility to be better. Mrs. Pemberton appeared in the doorway, her stern face showing rare vulnerability. Edmund just called, he's on his way. Apparently Victoria's lawyers received an anonymous package this morning containing copies of certain photographs, and they've withdrawn the emergency injunction effective immediately. Clara absorbed this, understanding the implications. The war's not over though, is it? No, dear, the housekeeper replied grimly. They'll just change tactics, but now they're fighting defensive battles instead of offensive ones, which is something. As morning light flooded Henry's bedroom, illuminating dust particles dancing in golden beams, Clara made a decision that crystallized everything. I'm going to use this money to create something good, a foundation or charity that actually helps people. That's what Henry would want, not revenge or punishment, but transformation of something corrupt into something meaningful. Thomas smiled, pride evident in his honest face. Then that's what we'll do together, and we'll honor Henry by proving his faith in you wasn't misplaced. But as they prepared to leave Henry's sanctuary, Clara noticed one more item in the safe. A small velvet box she'd missed in the initial shock. Inside was a simple silver locket containing 2 photographs, one of a young woman with kind eyes and familiar features, and one of Clara herself from her first day working at the manor. The inscription read, "To Clara, who reminds me of Catherine, my first love, the only person who ever saw me rather than my money, may you use this fortune to bring light where my family brought only darkness, with love and hope, Henry." Clara clutched the locket, finally understanding the depth of Henry's decision. He hadn't just given her money. He'd given her the chance to redeem his family's legacy, to transform corruption into compassion, to prove that character matters more than bloodline. "We won't let you down," she whispered to the empty room, to Henry's memory, to the weight of responsibility now resting on her shoulders. But even as determination filled her, a nagging question remained. If Henry had documented 30 years of family crimes, what else might be hidden in this massive estate, and what other secrets would surface as Clara began managing properties and businesses she knew nothing about? The answer, she suspected, would either vindicate Henry's choice or destroy everything he'd tried to build. Clara stood outside the mahogany doors of the Whitmore Industries boardroom exactly 2 weeks after discovering Henry's safe, her reflection in the polished brass handles showing a woman transformed from uncertain maid to determined heiress, wearing a tailored navy suit that Mrs. Pemberton had insisted she purchase. Edmund Cross stood beside her, his briefcase containing not just corporate documents but copies of Henry's evidence file, the nuclear option that would only be deployed if the board proved hostile beyond reason. "Remember," the lawyer advised quietly, straightening his tie with nervous precision, "you're not asking for their approval. You're informing them of the ownership transition. Henry left you controlling interest, which means 53% of voting shares. They can hate it, but they can't prevent it." Thomas had wanted to attend, but Clara convinced him to stay at the estate, partly because his presence might be seen as weakness, partly because she needed to prove to herself that she could face this battle alone. The boardroom was everything you'd expect from a century-old European conglomerate. A cathedral to capitalism with vaulted ceilings, walls lined with portraits of previous Whitmore leaders staring down with patriarchal judgment, and a massive table that could seat 30 people currently occupied by 15 men and 3 women who represented billions in assets across manufacturing, real estate, and technology sectors. Victoria sat at the far end, her designer suit armor against the humiliation of seeing her father's maid claim control of the family empire, her expression frozen in aristocratic disdain. Marcus occupied the seat that had traditionally belonged to the eldest son, his face still showing bruises from his forced removal from the estate, his eyes promising retribution. Sebastian slouched 2 chairs down, apparently drunk despite the 9 a.m. start time, his ruined gambling career now supplemented by his grandmother's trust fund that Henry couldn't touch. Reginald Blackwood, the company's chief operating officer for 20 years, sat at the head position that should have been Henry's, his silver hair and commanding presence suggesting someone accustomed to power. "Mrs. Bennet," Blackwood began without preamble, his voice carrying the bored condescension of old money addressing new. "We've convened this emergency meeting to discuss the rather irregular situation regarding company ownership and to determine the most appropriate path forward given recent developments." Clara took the seat Edmund indicated, directly opposite Blackwood, refusing to show intimidation despite every instinct screaming to run. "Mr. Blackwood, board members, I appreciate your time, and I understand this transition is unexpected. But I'm here to assure you that Whitmore Industries will continue operating with the same excellence that's defined it for generations." A woman to Clara's right, Margaret Chun, the chief financial officer, spoke with surgical precision. "Mrs. Bennet, with all due respect, you were employed as household staff 2 weeks ago. What qualifications do you possess to manage a multinational corporation with 17,000 employees and annual revenues exceeding €3 billion? The question was fair, devastatingly so, and Clara felt sweat forming despite the room's climate control. "You're absolutely correct that I lack traditional business experience," she admitted, deciding honesty was her only viable strategy. "Which is why I'm not planning to micromanage operations. Henry built an exceptional leadership team, and I intend to rely on your expertise while learning everything I can about how this company functions." Victoria's laugh was brittle and sharp. "How magnanimous. The maid acknowledges she's unqualified. Perhaps she'd also acknowledge that accepting this inheritance was a mistake and agree to negotiate a reasonable settlement." Edmund opened his briefcase, the click of the locks echoing like a warning shot. "Mrs. Whitmore, we've had this conversation with your lawyers. The will is ironclad. Your father was of sound mind, and any further challenges will result in the release of certain documents to authorities. Shall we review those again?" Victoria's face paled, and she fell silent, though her eyes promised this humiliation wouldn't be forgotten. Blackwood intervened smoothly, clearly uncomfortable with family drama contaminating business proceedings. "Perhaps we should discuss practical matters, Mrs. Bennet. Whitmore Industries has several major decisions pending. The acquisition of Stratford Technologies, the Frankfurt real estate development, and negotiations with the EU regarding environmental compliance across our manufacturing facilities. These require immediate executive approval." Clara pulled out notes she'd prepared with Edmund's help, aware that every person in the room was evaluating whether she'd sink or swim. "I've reviewed the Stratford acquisition proposal. The technology seems promising, but the price point suggests desperation on our part. I'd like to see revised terms that reflect our bargaining position more accurately." Blackwood's eyebrows rose fractionally, the first crack in his dismissive facade. "The current offer has been negotiated for 6 months. Then another month to get it right won't hurt," Clara replied, channeling Henry's decisive tone she'd heard in recordings. "And the Frankfurt development should be paused until we conduct independent environmental impact assessments, not the ones commissioned by developers who have financial interest in approval." Margaret Chin actually smiled, a brief expression quickly suppressed. "Those are surprisingly prudent observations." Marcus slammed his hand on the table, the sound explosive in the tense atmosphere. "This is absurd. We're letting a former maid dictate corporate strategy while qualified family members are sidelined. It's insanity." "Qualified family members who've never successfully managed anything except spending trust funds," Edmund interjected coldly, pulling out a document. "Shall we review Sebastian's failed tech startup that lost $8 million, or Victoria's disastrous interior design business that collapsed owing suppliers $2 million? Or perhaps Marcus's venture capital fund that somehow lost money during the biggest bull market in history?" The room fell silent, the Whitmore family's incompetence laid bare before business professionals who'd long suspected but never confronted it. Thomas Morrison, the company's general counsel and no relation to Clara's husband despite sharing a name, spoke carefully. "Mrs. Bennet, the legal reality is that you control the company, but the practical reality is that you need this board's cooperation to function effectively. May I suggest a compromise?" Clara nodded, grateful for any lifeline. "The board continues managing day-to-day operations as you have been, but major strategic decisions over €10 million require your approval after we present detailed analysis and recommendations. This allows you to learn while ensuring nothing catastrophic happens during the transition. It was reasonable, probably more reasonable than Clara had any right to expect. I accept that arrangement with one addition. I want full transparency, complete access to all records, attendance at all executive meetings, and honest assessments of problems, not sanitized versions designed to protect egos or hide mistakes. Blackwood studied her with new interest, reassessing his initial dismissal. You realize that level of access will reveal things about your predecessor that may be uncomfortable? Henry showed me who he really was, Clara replied, thinking of the safe's contents. I doubt company operations will shock me more than what I've already discovered. A younger man, probably late 30s, spoke from the middle of the table. I'm David Walsh, head of sustainable development, a position Henry created 2 years ago despite board resistance. And I just want to say that I'm willing to give you a genuine chance because Henry's judgment was usually sound, even when it seemed crazy. Several heads nodded agreement, and Clara felt the room's temperature shift slightly from hostile to cautiously neutral. Thank you, Mr. Walsh. I'd like to schedule individual meetings with each department head to understand your operations better, and I promise to listen more than I speak, at least initially. The meeting continued for another hour, reviewing quarterly reports, approving routine expenditures, and establishing protocols for Clara's involvement that wouldn't paralyze operations. Victoria remained silent, radiating fury, while Marcus took notes with the intensity of someone planning revenge, and Sebastian passed out quietly in his chair, unnoticed by anyone except Clara, who felt pity despite everything. As the meeting adjourned, Blackwood approached Clara with surprising warmth. Mrs. Bennet, you handled that better than expected. Henry must have seen something in you that wasn't immediately apparent, and I'm willing to reserve judgment until we see how you perform under pressure. Margaret Chin joined them, her expression neutral but eyes showing curiosity. I'd like to schedule time to review our financial systems. If you're serious about understanding operations, start with where the money flows. It tells you everything about what a company really values. Clara accepted gratefully, exchanging contact information, slowly building bridges that might make this impossible situation survivable. Edmund guided her toward the exit, but Victoria intercepted them in the corridor, her composure cracking to reveal raw desperation. You don't understand what you've done, she hissed, close enough that Clara could smell expensive perfume mixed with fear. This company was supposed to be Sebastian's, Marcus's, mine. We grew up knowing it would be ours, and you've stolen not just money but identity, legacy, everything that defined us. Clara felt unexpected. Sympathy for this woman who'd built her entire self-worth on future inheritance. Victoria, Henry didn't steal anything from you. He gave you exactly what you earned through your choices and actions. If that feels like nothing, maybe examine why. The older woman's hand lashed out, slapping Clara hard enough that the sound echoed in the marble corridor, security guards immediately moving to intervene. You self-righteous little thief. You think you're better than us because you married some peasant and pretended to care about a lonely old man, but you're just a con artist who got lucky. Edmund stepped between them, his voice arctic. Mrs. Whitmore, that assault was witnessed by security cameras, and I'm certain Mrs. Bennet would be willing to press charges unless you leave immediately and cease all contact outside official legal channels. Victoria fled, her heels clicking rapid retreat, leaving Clara touching her stinging cheek and fighting tears. Are you all right? Edmund asked with genuine concern. Physically, yes, Clara replied. Emotionally, I'm not sure, Edmund. Am I doing the right thing? Maybe I should just sell everything, distribute the money somehow, and walk away from this nightmare. The lawyer guided her to a window overlooking the city where Whitmore Industries had operated for over a century. Henry didn't give you this company because he thought it would be easy or pleasant. He gave it to you because he believed you'd use it to do good in ways his family never would. Walking away means they win by default, and his sacrifice of his final years planning this becomes meaningless. Clara watched pedestrians below, ordinary people living ordinary lives, unaware that the building above them had just witnessed a transfer of power that defied every norm of inheritance and privilege. Then I stay, she decided. But I'm going to need help, real help from people who understand business and ethics. Can you recommend consultants or advisors who aren't connected to the Whitmore family? Edmund smiled, pulling out his phone. I know exactly the people. Give me 24 hours to make some calls. Henry wasn't the only powerful person who disliked how entitled wealth operates in this city. That evening, Clara sat in Henry's study at the manor. Now officially her study, though it still felt like trespassing. reviewing company documents that Margaret Chen had sent over. The numbers were staggering. Whitmore Industries controlled assets worth nearly €2 billion beyond the personal estate, employed people across 12 countries, and influenced markets from technology to real estate to manufacturing. Thomas brought her dinner on a tray, his presence comforting as he settled into the chair opposite. "How was the board meeting?" Clara laughed, the sound slightly hysterical. "I got slapped by Victoria, tacitly threatened by Marcus, and watched Sebastian pass out drunk, so about as well as could be expected." She touched her still red cheek. "But the actual business people seemed willing to give me a chance, which is more than I hoped for." Thomas reached across the desk to take her hand. "You're going to be incredible at this once you find your footing. You managed an entire household staff, coordinated massive events, handled budgets. It's not that different from running a company, just bigger numbers." "Much bigger numbers," Clara corrected, showing him a spreadsheet where a single-line item exceeded their previous annual salary by a factor of 10,000. "Thomas, what if I make a mistake that costs people their jobs or destroys value? These aren't theoretical consequences. They're real people depending on decisions I'm barely qualified to make." Her husband stood, moving around the desk to wrap his arms around her from behind, his solid warmth anchoring her anxiety. "Then you'll fix it, you'll learn from it, and you'll do better next time." Henry didn't expect perfection, he expected integrity, and that you have in abundance. A knock interrupted the moment, Mrs. Pemberton entering with her usual impeccable timing. "Excuse me, Mrs. Bennet, but there's a gentleman at the gate claiming to be a journalist from the Financial Times, asking for an interview about your unprecedented rise from servant to heiress. Shall I send him away?" Clara's stomach sank, realizing that media attention was inevitable and potentially devastating. "Tell him no comment for now, but Edmund will provide a statement tomorrow. We need to control this narrative before it controls us." After Mrs. Pemberton left, Clara returned to Henry's journal, finding an entry from 5 years ago when she'd first started working at the manor. "New maid today, Clara Morrison, quiet girl with sad eyes but incredible attention to detail. She noticed the roses in the east garden were dying from root rot that the groundskeeper missed, and spent her afternoon researching treatment solutions on her break, the kind of person who sees problems and fixes them rather than waiting for someone else to care." Clara hadn't remembered that incident specifically, but it was typical of how she'd always approached work, seeing the job not as beneath her, but as an opportunity to make things better. "He was watching me from the beginning," she realized aloud, "evaluating whether I was genuine or performing, testing my character in small ways before trusting me with everything." Thomas read over her shoulder, his expression thoughtful. "And you passed every test without even knowing you were being tested. That's why his trust was earned, not manipulated." The phone on Henry's desk rang, an ancient landline that Clara hadn't known still worked, and she answered hesitantly. "Mrs. Bennet, this is David Walsh from the Sustainability Department." The voice from the board meeting came through clearly. "I'm calling to give you a heads up that Blackwood is planning to undermine your authority by approving the Stratford acquisition anyway, claiming that since negotiations predate your ownership, you don't have veto power." Clara's grip tightened on the receiver, anger replacing anxiety. "Can he do that legally?" "Technically, yes. The acquisition contracts were signed before Henry's death. But ethically, it's a clear power play to test whether you'll fight back or accept being sidelined." David paused. "I'm telling you this because I think you have good instincts about that deal. The technology is overvalued and Stratford's CEO has connections to some questionable offshore accounts." This was it, Clara realized, the first real test of whether she could actually lead or would be steamrolled by more experienced operators. "David, can you get me everything you have on Stratford, the good, bad, and ugly, by tomorrow morning?" "Already compiled and sending to your email now," he replied with audible satisfaction. "I've been suspicious of this deal for months, but Blackwood dismissed my concerns. Maybe he'll listen to the owner." After hanging up, Clara opened her laptop to find David's report. 40 pages of analysis showing Stratford Technologies was essentially a shell company inflating its value through accounting tricks, that the acquisition would saddle Whitmore Industries with debt and worthless patents, and that Blackwood likely had personal financial incentive to push it through. "They think I'm too inexperienced to catch this," she said, showing Thomas the evidence. "Blackwood is counting on me being intimidated and trusting his expertise, but Henry taught me to question everything and verify independently." Thomas grinned, fierce pride evident. "So what are you going to do?" Clara pulled up her email, typing with decisive keystrokes. I'm calling an emergency executive committee meeting for tomorrow, presenting this analysis, and killing the Stratford deal permanently. And if Blackwood objects, I'm exercising my authority as controlling shareholder to overrule him and remind everyone exactly who owns this company. She hit send, the email notification probably waking up board members across the city. Henry wanted someone who wouldn't be bullied by powerful men who think they know better. Well, he got what he wanted. As night deepened over the Whitmore estate, Clara felt something shift inside her. A transformation from uncertain inheritor to determined leader who would fight for Henry's vision, even if it meant making enemies of everyone. The journalist at the gate, Victoria's slap, Blackwood's power play, they were all tests of whether she deserved this impossible inheritance. And Clara was done apologizing for being chosen. But as she prepared for tomorrow's confrontation, one question haunted her. How many more enemies would she make before this was over, and would there come a point where the cost of fighting became greater than the value of winning? Have you ever discovered that the ground you thought was solid beneath your feet was actually quicksand pulling you down? Clara arrived at Whitmore Industries headquarters at 7 a.m., 2 hours before the emergency executive committee meeting she'd called. Her navy suit replaced by a charcoal gray power ensemble that Mrs. Pemberton insisted made her look appropriately formidable for corporate warfare. David Walsh met her in the empty lobby, his young face showing exhaustion suggesting he'd worked through the night, carrying a leather portfolio that bulged with additional documentation. I found something else, he said without preamble, guiding her toward the executive elevators. After I sent you the Stratford analysis, I couldn't sleep, so I started digging deeper into Blackwood's financial disclosures, and Clara, it's worse than we thought. They rode to the 20th floor in tense silence, the elevator's mirrored walls reflecting two people about to drop a grenade into a corporate empire. David's office was modest compared to the executive suites, filled with sustainability reports and environmental impact studies. But his computer setup was impressive, multiple monitors displaying financial data that made Clara's head spin. Blackwood owns 17% of a holding company called Meridian Capital, David explained, pulling up incorporation documents, which on the surface looks like a legitimate investment firm, but when you trace the ownership structure through 3 layers of shell companies, you find that Meridian is actually controlled by Marcus Whitmore. Clara's breath caught, the implications crystallizing with horrifying clarity. They're working together. Blackwood and Marcus have been conspiring to what exactly? David pulled up more documents, his fingers flying across keyboards with practiced efficiency. To strip assets from Whitmore Industries through overvalued acquisitions and favorable contracts with companies they secretly control, the Stratford deal would have funneled €80 million into a technology company that Meridian owns 40% of, essentially transferring your money into Marcus's pocket while saddling the company with worthless patents. The betrayal was breathtaking in its audacity and complexity. How long has this been going on? Clara demanded, scanning documents showing similar transactions dating back 3 years. At least since Henry's first heart attack, David confirmed. They probably assumed he'd die soon and Victoria or Marcus would inherit, making their scheme invisible. But then Henry kept living, and eventually he figured out something was wrong. Look at this. He pulled up internal memos showing Henry questioning certain acquisitions, demanding audits, and receiving explanations from Blackwood that seemed reasonable, but were actually carefully constructed lies. Henry knew, Clara breathed, understanding flooding through her. That's why he documented everything, why he chose me instead of his family. He discovered they were literally stealing from their own company. David nodded grimly. And when Henry changed his will, they didn't abandon the plan, they just modified it. If they could undermine your authority, prove you incompetent, and force you to sell your shares, Marcus could acquire control through Meridian at a fraction of market value, and Blackwood would be rewarded with a massive payout. The conspiracy was elegant in its cruelty, turning Clara's inheritance into a trap. We need to bring this to authorities, she said, reaching for her phone, but David stopped her. Wait, if we go public now, we tip them off before we know the full scope. I've been building a network of allies in the company, people who've been suspicious but afraid to speak up, and we think the conspiracy extends beyond just Blackwood and Marcus. Clara's stomach dropped further. Who else? Before David could answer, his office door burst open and Margaret Chin entered, her usually composed face showing cracks of fury. Good, you're both here. We need to talk immediately before the 9 o'clock meeting. The CFO closed the door, checking to ensure they had privacy, her movements sharp with controlled anger. I've been reviewing financial records all night after our board meeting yesterday, and I found irregularities that suggest systematic fraud spanning multiple departments. David's right to be paranoid, because this goes deeper than one corrupt COO. She spread printouts across David's desk, highlighting transactions that made no business sense unless you assumed malicious intent. Thomas Morrison, our general counsel who seemed so reasonable yesterday, has been approving contracts with legal language that heavily favors outside parties while exposing Whitmore Industries to unnecessary liability. His law school roommate happens to be Sebastian Whitmore's bankruptcy attorney. The web expanded before Clara's eyes, each revelation adding another strand. And Reginald Blackwood's daughter, Margaret continued, her voice tight with controlled rage, is engaged to Victoria Whitmore's son from her first marriage, making them practically family. This isn't just corporate fraud, it's a coordinated family conspiracy to loot the company before anyone notices. David pulled up an organizational chart, marking suspected conspirators with red dots. We estimate at least 7 senior executives are compromised, either through direct financial incentive, family connections, or blackmail material that the Whitmores have accumulated over years of surveillance. Clara felt walls closing in, realizing she'd walked into a trap far more sophisticated than simple greed. The board meeting yesterday was theater, she understood suddenly. They were evaluating how much I knew, whether I'd be a problem or could be managed, and my questioning of the Stratford deal marked me as dangerous. Margaret nodded approvingly. Exactly, which is why the 9 o'clock meeting will be an ambush. They'll have prepared arguments about why your emergency session violates corporate governance. They'll question your mental competence. And they'll probably present a vote of no confidence designed to force you out despite your majority ownership. The CFO's expression softened slightly. But you're not alone. David and I have been quietly documenting this fraud for months. We're joined by Patricia Reeves in Human Resources, James Chun in Operations, no relation to me, and Anthony DeSantos in International Development, all people Henry personally hired who are loyal to the company rather than the family. David added names to his organizational chart in green, showing allies scattered throughout the corporate structure. We've been waiting for someone with the authority to act. Henry was too ill in his final months, and we feared Victoria or Marcus inheriting would mean we'd have to go to authorities and watch the company collapse in scandal. Clara paced David's small office, her mind racing through scenarios and consequences. If we expose this at the meeting, Blackwood and his conspirators will claim we're making unfounded accusations. They'll demand investigations that they'll use to delay and obfuscate, and meanwhile they'll be destroying evidence and building legal defenses. Margaret smiled, a sharp expression that transformed her professional demeanor into something predatory. Unless we have evidence so comprehensive and damning that denial becomes impossible, which thanks to David's late-night hacking of Blackwood's email server, we now possess. She pulled out a USB drive, holding it like a weapon. Every email between Blackwood and Marcus for the past 3 years, including explicit discussions of their scheme, projections of how much they'd steal, and contingency plans for dealing with Henry if he became too suspicious. Clara took the drive, its physical weight nothing compared to the power it represented. Is this legal evidence? David grimaced. Legally obtained? Absolutely not. I accessed Blackwood's email without authorization, which makes it inadmissible in criminal proceedings, but admissibility doesn't matter for our purposes. He pulled up an email dated 6 months ago showing Blackwood writing to Marcus. Henry's getting suspicious about the Stratford valuations. We may need to accelerate the timeline before he orders a comprehensive audit. Can Sebastian create some crisis to distract him? We're not trying to send them to prison, at least not yet, Margaret clarified. We're trying to save Whitmore Industries by removing the cancer before it kills the host. Once they're gone and unable to obstruct, we can provide clean evidence to authorities for prosecution. Clara understood the strategy, but balked at the ethical implications. So we blackmail them into resigning by threatening to expose evidence we obtained illegally? We give them the choice, David corrected. Resign quietly, and we don't pursue criminal charges, or fight, and we release everything to media and authorities, accepting that some evidence gets thrown out, but enough remains to destroy their reputations and likely result in convictions on securities fraud and conspiracy charges. It was ruthless, probably necessary, and exactly the kind of morally gray decision Clara had never imagined making. Henry would approve, Margaret said quietly, reading Clara's expression. He built this company over 50 years, employed thousands of people, and created real value before his family decided it was their personal piggy bank, were fighting to preserve his legacy, not just your inheritance. A knock on the door made everyone freeze, and Patricia Reeves entered, a formidable woman in her 60s with iron-gray hair and eyes that had seen every corporate scheme imaginable. "The conspirators are gathering in Blackwood's office," she reported. "I positioned a cleaning crew to work nearby, and they're placing prepared statements about Clara's incompetence, discussing how to frame the no-confidence vote, and Marcus is on speakerphone coordinating strategy." She pulled out her own phone, playing an audio recording that made Clara's blood run cold. "The maid doesn't know what she's walking into." Marcus's voice came through clearly. "By 10 a.m. she'll be voted out. By noon we'll have filed emergency motions to freeze her shares pending competency evaluation. And by next week she'll be so buried in legal proceedings that she'll beg to sell us the company just to escape." Blackwood's laugh followed. "And the beautiful part is it's all technically legal. Corporate governance allows board removal of ineffective leadership, and her complete lack of business experience gives us all the justification we need." Patricia stopped the recording, her expression disgusted. "They're planning to destroy you professionally and personally, Clara, using every tool of corporate and legal warfare, and they think you're too naive to see it coming." Clara looked at the four people who'd chosen to risk their careers helping her. Virtual strangers united only by loyalty to Henry's memory and belief in ethical business. "Then we need to hit them first, harder than they're expecting, and make it clear that underestimating me was their fatal mistake." She checked her watch. 7:45, 75 minutes until the meeting that would determine everything. "David, compile the most damning emails into a presentation. Nothing illegal about showing someone their own correspondence. Margaret, prepare financial analysis showing exactly how much they've stolen and how much more they plan to steal. Patricia, I need you to secure the boardroom and ensure no one tampers with audiovisual equipment." The three executives moved with military precision, energized by finally having leadership willing to fight. "What about Thomas Morrison, our general counsel?" Clara asked. "If he's compromised, we need legal representation we can trust." Margaret pulled out her phone. "I called Judith Blackstone at 3 a.m. She's senior partner at Morrison & Wade, no relation to our Thomas, and she's been waiting for an excuse to go after Blackwood's corruption for years. She'll be here by 8:30 with her litigation team." Within an hour, Henry's study had been recreated in a 20th floor conference room, documents spreading across tables, allies coordinating strategy, and Clara at the center transforming from uncertain heiress to war general. Edmund Cross arrived at 8:15, his usual composure cracking when Clara briefed him on the conspiracy. "My God, I knew Marcus was greedy, but this level of organized fraud." Henry would be heartbroken and furious simultaneously. He reviewed the evidence with a lawyer's eye for detail. "This is sufficient to pursue both criminal and civil proceedings. We're talking decades in prison and hundreds of millions in damages." Judith Blackstone arrived exactly at 8:30, a woman in her 70s with white hair, sharp blue eyes, and a reputation for demolishing corporate criminals in cross-examination. "Mrs. Bennett, I've waited 20 years to catch Reginald Blackwood in actionable fraud, and you've just handed me Christmas. Let's destroy these parasites." The team refined their strategy. Clara would allow Blackwood to present his no-confidence motion, let him feel confident in his ambush, and then systematically dismantle his authority by exposing the conspiracy with evidence so overwhelming that board members not part of the scheme would have no choice but to side with her. "The goal isn't just removing Blackwood," Judith explained. "It's demonstrating that you're capable of leadership by outmaneuvering experienced operators who assumed you'd be easy prey. Nothing commands respect like defeating people who underestimated you." At 8:55, Clara entered the boardroom where 15 board members waited, Blackwood sitting at the head position with Marcus beside him in a guest chair that technically wasn't allowed, their confident expressions suggesting they'd already won. "Mrs. Bennett," Blackwood began before Clara even sat. "Thank you for calling this emergency meeting. It's actually fortuitous timing because several board members have expressed concerns about recent decisions that we need to address." Victoria watched from the gallery, her smile predatory, and Sebastian leaned against the wall with a flask, probably already drunk despite the early hour. Clara took her seat calmly, David, Margaret, Patricia, Edmund, and Judith arraying themselves behind her like an honor guard. "Please proceed, Mr. Blackwood. I'm eager to hear these concerns." The COO pulled out prepared remarks, his voice carrying rehearsed authority. The board has observed your involvement over the past 2 weeks with growing alarm. Specifically, your unilateral decision to halt the Stratford Technologies acquisition represents an overreach of authority and demonstrates fundamental misunderstanding of corporate strategy. He looked around the table, counting votes he assumed were secure. Furthermore, your lack of relevant experience poses unacceptable risk to shareholder value. And while we respect Henry's decision, respecting it doesn't mean allowing the company to be damaged by well-intentioned but unqualified leadership. Thomas Morrison, the general counsel, stood smoothly. I've prepared corporate governance documentation supporting a board vote of no confidence, which would remove Mrs. Bennett from operational authority pending the appointment of professional management. It was exactly the ambush predicted, and Clara let it play out, watching faces around the table to identify who was surprised versus who'd been briefed in advance. 6 board members looked shocked, suggesting they weren't part of the conspiracy, while 7 showed no reaction, already knowing what was coming. That's quite an elaborate presentation, Mr. Blackwood, Clara said when he finished, her voice calm. I appreciate the effort you've put into documenting my alleged incompetence. Now let me show you what I've put effort into documenting. David connected his laptop to the boardroom display, and the first slide appeared showing email correspondence between Blackwood and Marcus discussing the Stratford scheme. The confidence drained from Blackwood's face, replaced by calculating assessment of how much she knew. That's privileged executive communication taken out of context, he blustered, but his voice lacked conviction. Margaret advanced to the next slide showing financial analysis of how the Stratford acquisition would have transferred €80 million to Meridian Capital. Nothing out of context about this, Reginald. You've been systematically looting Whitmore Industries for 3 years in partnership with Marcus Whitmore, and we have documentation of 17 separate fraudulent transactions, totaling approximately €240 million. The room erupted, board members shouting questions, Marcus standing with face purple and fists clenched, Victoria fleeing the gallery before she could be implicated. Patricia advanced slides showing the network of conspirators, each name appearing with evidence of their participation, and watching Thomas Morrison realize his involvement was exposed was grimly satisfying. This is fabricated, Blackwood roared, desperation replacing calculation. Manufactured evidence designed to discredit legitimate concerns about incompetent leadership. Judith Blackstone stood, her presence commanding immediate silence. Mr. Blackwood, I'm Judith Blackstone representing Mrs. Bennett, and nothing presented here is fabricated. In fact, we have significantly more evidence that we're prepared to provide to securities regulators, tax authorities, and criminal prosecutors unless you and your co-conspirators resign immediately. She laid out terms with surgical precision. You have 2 choices: resign within the hour, sign comprehensive non-disclosure agreements, forfeit all stock options and deferred compensation, and accept permanent bans from serving as corporate officers in any European company. In exchange, we won't pursue criminal prosecution. Her eyes were ice. Or refuse, and we release everything to media while simultaneously filing criminal complaints for fraud, conspiracy, embezzlement, and securities violations, ensuring you spend your retirement in prison rather than on whatever yacht you'd planned to purchase with stolen money. The silence was absolute, broken only by Marcus slamming his fist on the table hard enough to crack the wood. You can't prove any of this. It's circumstantial speculation by a desperate maid trying to justify her theft of our family's company. David advanced to an email showing Marcus explicitly instructing Blackwood to accelerate asset extraction before Henry recovers enough to order forensic audits. Your words, your email account, your criminal conspiracy, David said flatly. Circumstantial this is not. One by one, the conspirators understood they'd lost, that Clara had outmaneuvered them completely, and that fighting would only make consequences worse. Thomas Morrison stood first, his resignation verbal, but legally binding once recorded. I resign effective immediately, and I'll sign whatever documents are required. 4 more executives followed, a cascade of capitulation from people who'd assumed they'd feast on a helpless victim. Blackwood remained defiant until Judith played. The recording Patricia had captured that morning, his own voice discussing plans to destroy Clara echoing through the boardroom. Damn you, he whispered, finally broken. Damn Henry for choosing her, and damn her for being smarter than she looked. He stood with whatever dignity remained. I resign effective immediately, and I'll sign your documents, but understand that you've made enemies who won't forget this humiliation. Clara felt no triumph, only grim satisfaction at protecting Henry's legacy. Mr. Blackwood, if you'd treated this company with the loyalty it deserved instead of seeing it as something to plunder, we wouldn't be having this conversation. You made yourself my enemy long before I knew you existed. The meeting concluded with emergency votes appointing interim leadership, Margaret Chin becoming acting COO, David Walsh elevated to Chief Strategy Officer, and Patricia Reeves expanding her role to include corporate ethics oversight. By noon, 7 executives had resigned, Marcus had been permanently banned from company property, and Victoria was facing her own legal exposure for receiving proceeds from the conspiracy. Edmund coordinated with authorities, providing the clean evidence while keeping David's hacking confidential, ensuring prosecutions would proceed based on legitimate documentation. That evening, Clara stood in Henry's study with Thomas, both exhausted but relieved. "You did it," her husband said with profound pride. "You saw the trap, turned it against them, and saved the company in your second week of ownership. Henry knew exactly what he was doing choosing you." Clara collapsed into Henry's leather chair, the weight of the day crushing down. "But at what cost, Thomas? I've made lifelong enemies of the Whitmore family, destroyed careers, and discovered that even allies like Margaret and David were keeping secrets about corporate fraud." She pulled out Henry's journal, finding an entry that seemed prophetic. "Leadership isn't about being liked, it's about making impossible choices between bad options and slightly less bad options, then living with consequences that follow you forever. I've made enemies of everyone who ever loved me by choosing what was right over what was easy, and I'd do it again because that's what integrity demands." Thomas knelt beside her chair, taking her hands. "You didn't make enemies by being cruel. You made enemies by refusing to let them steal and destroy. There's a difference." A knock announced Edmund with news. "The regulatory investigations are moving forward. Initial estimates suggest we'll recover approximately 60% of stolen assets, and the remaining board members voted unanimously to grant you full operational authority. You've won, Clara, completely and decisively." But victory felt hollow as Clara considered the cost, the relationships destroyed, the family permanently fractured, the conspiracy that had operated for years under Henry's nose. Henry knew something was wrong but died before he could fix it, she realized. So he left the company to someone he hoped would be strong enough to do what he couldn't, and brutal enough to make the necessary cuts. Judith Blackstone arrived with final documents, her satisfaction evident. "Blackwood is finished in European business. Marcus faces potential criminal charges, and you've established yourself as someone not to be underestimated. Well done, Mrs. Bennet." After everyone left, Clara and Thomas sat in comfortable silence, processing the battle they'd won but the war that continued. "What happens now?" Thomas asked the question that haunted both of them. Clara opened her laptop, looking at the company she now actually controlled. Thousands of employees depending on decisions she'd make, competitors circling for weakness, and the Whitmore family's hatred burning somewhere in the city. "Now we rebuild," she said with growing conviction. "We turn this company into something that actually helps people. We use the wealth ethically, and we prove Henry was right to trust me with his legacy." But as night fell over the city, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that exposing Blackwood's conspiracy had only revealed the surface of something darker, that Henry's safe had contained evidence of crimes spanning decades, and that somewhere in the vast Whitmore empire, other secrets waited to destroy everything she'd fought to protect. What else had Henry discovered that he'd taken to his grave? And would Clara be ready when those secrets inevitably surfaced? What if the person you thought you knew had been haunted by a choice made decades ago that shaped every decision thereafter? Clara discovered the locked drawer in Henry's desk 3 weeks after the boardroom victory, her fingers tracing the ornate woodwork during a late-night review of corporate documents when she accidentally triggered a hidden release mechanism that clicked open with a sound like a secret finally exhaling. Inside lay a single manila envelope, yellowed with age, sealed with red wax bearing Henry's personal insignia, and across the front in his younger, steadier handwriting. "For Clara, if you found this, then you're ready to understand why I chose you." Thomas was asleep upstairs in what was now their bedroom, the master suite that still felt too grand, too presumptuous, despite Edmund's insistence that Clara claim the spaces Henry intended for her. The estate was silent except for distant sounds of Mrs. Pemberton securing the house for the night, her nightly ritual unchanged by the transfer of ownership, providing continuity in a world turned upside down. Clara broke the seal carefully, feeling like an archaeologist opening a tomb, and inside found photographs, letters, and a handwritten narrative in Henry's precise script that began with words that made her hands tremble. My name is Henry Whitmore, I am 28 years old, and I have just made a choice that will haunt me for the rest of my life. The photographs showed a young Henry, handsome and idealistic, standing beside a beautiful woman with kind eyes and familiar features that made Clara's breath catch because she was looking at herself in a mirror distorted by decades. Her name was Catherine Morrison, Henry's narrative continued. She was a maid in my father's house, the daughter of our groundskeeper, and she was the only person in my privileged world who saw me as Henry rather than as the Whitmore heir. We fell in love despite the impossible gulf between our circumstances. Clara looked closer at Catherine's photograph, the resemblance uncanny enough to suggest either remarkable coincidence or something like genetic memory manifesting across generations. The narrative detailed a secret romance spanning 3 years, meetings in the estate's gardens, conversations about books and philosophy, a connection that transcended class boundaries that Europe in the 1970s still rigidly enforced. I plan to marry her, Henry wrote, his younger self's optimism bleeding through the page. I didn't care about my father's threats to disinherit me, about society's judgment, about the scandal that would follow. Catherine made me believe that love and integrity mattered more than money or status. But the narrative's tone shifted, darkening with words that carried 50 years of regret. Then my father discovered our relationship and made me an offer that revealed exactly who I was beneath my idealistic pretensions. He would give Catherine £1 million, enough to live comfortably forever, if I married Victoria Ashford as planned and never contacted Catherine again. Clara's heart broke reading what came next, knowing how the story ended because she lived in a world shaped by Henry's choice. I told myself I was protecting Catherine from the cruelty she'd face as my wife, that society would destroy her, that I was being noble by setting her free with financial security. But the truth was simpler and more shameful. I was a coward who chose comfort over love, status over integrity, and I've spent 50 years trying to atone for that weakness. The photographs showed Catherine's devastation, a series of images that must have been taken by someone Henry hired to ensure she was all right, documenting her collecting the money, leaving the estate, and disappearing into a life Henry's narrative admitted he'd tracked from a distance. She used the money to open a small bookshop in Cornwall, Henry continued. She married a kind man named Robert Morrison 5 years later, had a daughter they named Sarah, and lived what appeared from my surveillance to be a genuinely happy life. But I wonder if she ever forgave me, if she understood that I thought about her every single day, if she knew that my marriage to Victoria was a prison I'd constructed from cowardice. Clara calculated dates, generations, and felt understanding crystallize with stunning clarity. Catherine Morrison was your grandmother. Thomas's voice came from the doorway, startling Clara who hadn't heard him descend. That's why you look like her. Why Henry chose you. He was trying to give Catherine's descendants what he denied her 50 years ago. Her husband crossed to the desk, reading over her shoulder, his calloused hands gentle on her shoulders. My grandmother died when I was 10, Clara whispered, memories flooding back. She ran a bookshop in Cornwall. Always had this sadness in her eyes that my mother said came from some early heartbreak, and she left me a locket when she died containing a photograph of a young man she'd never identified. She rushed to their bedroom, retrieving the silver locket she'd worn since childhood, opening it to reveal the photograph inside. A young Henry Whitmore, the same image that appeared in his narrative, smiling with an openness that later photographs never captured. She kept his picture her entire life, Clara breathed, tears streaming freely now. Even after marrying, having children, building a happy life, she never forgot him. Thomas held her as she wept for a grandmother she'd barely known, for Henry's lifetime of regret, for a love story that ended in separation rather than triumph. So Henry saw Catherine in you, he said gently. Gave you everything he'd denied her, tried to rewrite history by ensuring her granddaughter inherited what should have been hers. Clara returned to Henry's narrative, finding more photographs showing Catherine in her bookshop. Older now but still beautiful, the sadness Thomas mentioned evident even in candid shots. I visited her once, Henry's handwriting grew shakier, suggesting this section was written recently. 40 years after our separation, I stood outside her bookshop pretending to browse, and she emerged to help an elderly customer. She didn't recognize me. Time had changed us both too much, and I watched her treat that customer with such genuine kindness that I understood what I'd lost by choosing money over her. The passage continued with devastating honesty. She died 3 years ago, and I attended her funeral from a distance, watching her family mourn, her daughter Sarah giving a eulogy about a woman who taught her that dignity and kindness mattered more than wealth, and I wept for the life we could have had, for the children we might have raised to value character over money, for the love I'd traded for an empire that brought me nothing but loneliness. Clara found more recent documents, investigation reports showing Henry discovering Clara's employment history, tracking her through various positions before arranging her hiring at Whitmore Manor 5 years ago. When I learned Catherine's granddaughter was working as a maid, the symmetry felt like divine intervention or cosmic justice, Henry wrote in his final entries. I watched Clara for 5 years, testing whether she'd inherited Catherine's character or if genetics meant nothing, and everything I observed convinced me that Catherine lived on in this remarkable young woman. The narrative concluded with instructions. Clara, if you're reading this, then you've survived the initial onslaught from my family, proven yourself capable of protecting what I've built, and earned the right to understand your true inheritance. This isn't just money or property. It's a second chance at the choice I failed 50 years ago. I'm giving you the power to choose integrity over expedience, character over comfort, everything I couldn't choose when it mattered. Henry's final words carried the weight of a deathbed confession. Use this fortune to honor Catherine's memory by living the values she embodied. Prove that her granddaughter has the strength I lacked. And perhaps in some small way my choice to give you everything might balance the scales for denying her the life we could have shared. Forgive an old man's attempt at redemption, Henry. Clara sat in stunned silence, processing revelations that recontextualized everything. Her inheritance wasn't random kindness to a faithful employee, but a billionaire's attempt to atone for his greatest regret by giving Catherine's descendant the life he'd denied Catherine herself. This changes things, Thomas said quietly, and Clara heard the uncertainty in his voice, the question of whether she'd been chosen for herself or as a proxy for someone else. Does it? She asked, genuinely unsure. I'm still the same person who worked here for 5 years, still married you, still made the choices that led to this moment. The fact that Henry saw my grandmother in me doesn't negate my own identity. But even as she spoke, doubt crept in, poisonous and insidious. Mrs. Pemberton knocked softly, entering with tea service despite the late hour, her presence suggesting she'd known about this secret. You knew, Clara stated, not quite an accusation but close. The elderly housekeeper poured tea with steady hands. Henry told me about Catherine 30 years ago during a moment of particular loneliness, and yes, I knew he'd arranged your hiring, though I didn't understand why until after his death when Edmund mentioned the resemblance to someone in old photographs. She met Clara's eyes directly. But Henry didn't invent your character, dear. He simply recognized it. You would have been exactly who you are regardless of genetics or his schemes. He just ensured you had the opportunity to prove it. Clara wanted to believe that, but uncertainty gnawed at her foundations. What if everything I thought was my own merit was actually just genetic similarity to someone Henry loved and lost? What if I'm not actually capable of this responsibility, and he only thought I was because I reminded him of her? Thomas took her hands, his grip firm and grounding. Clara, you've defeated corporate conspiracies, outmaneuvered experienced executives, and protected thousands of employees in 3 weeks of ownership. That's not genetics or resemblance. That's you, your intelligence, your courage, your character. Mrs. Pemberton added sugar to Clara's tea without asking, knowing her preference from years of observation. Henry chose you because you earned it through 5 years of demonstrating exactly who you are. The Catherine connection simply helped him see what was already there, like recognizing a familiar melody in a new song. Clara sipped tea, letting the familiar ritual calm her spinning thoughts, and gradually understanding began to crystallize through the chaos. Henry couldn't choose love over money when he was young, she said slowly, working through implications. So he spent 50 years building an empire, then gave it to someone he hoped would make better choices, not despite resembling Catherine, but because resembling her suggested I might have inherited her values. She looked at the photographs spread across the desk, young Catherine and young Henry frozen in a moment of possibility that ended in separation and regret. He's asking me to succeed where he failed, to use wealth without being corrupted by it, to choose integrity even when it's difficult. That's the real inheritance, the challenge to be better than he was. Thomas smiled, relief evident. Exactly, and you've already proven yourself capable, the boardroom victory, exposing Blackwood, protecting employees. Those were your choices, your intelligence, your strength. But Mrs. Pemberton's expression remained concerned. There's one more thing you should know, dear. Catherine visited the manor once, about 6 months before she died. I didn't recognize her at first, time changes everyone. but she asked to walk through the gardens one final time, said she wanted to remember something beautiful before she forgot everything. Clara's breath caught. Henry knew she was here. He watched from his window, the housekeeper confirmed, too afraid to approach, too consumed by regret, and after she left he wrote the narrative you just read. He died knowing she'd returned to the place they'd fallen in love, wondering if she'd forgiven him, hoping that giving you everything might earn forgiveness he didn't deserve. The tragedy of two people who'd loved each other, but been separated by cowardice and class made Clara's heart ache for what might have been. So in the end, Henry gave me the choice he couldn't make for himself, love and integrity versus wealth and status, except he rigged the game by giving me both and asking me to prove they're not mutually exclusive. She stood, pacing Henry's study that contained so many layers of secrets. The Whitmore family thinks I stole their inheritance, but the truth is Henry was returning something he stole from Catherine, giving her granddaughter the life he denied her. It's poetic justice or cosmic balance, or maybe just an old man's desperate attempt at redemption. Thomas joined her at the window overlooking gardens where Catherine and Henry had once walked together, now maintained by groundskeepers who didn't know the romance that had bloomed among those roses. What are you going to do with this information? Clara considered carefully, weighing obligations and consequences. Nothing publicly. This story is Henry's private shame and Catherine's private heartbreak. They deserve to rest without becoming tabloid entertainment. But privately, I'm going to honor Catherine by using this fortune exactly as she would have, helping people, creating opportunities, proving that her values matter more than Whitmore pride. She turned to Mrs. Pemberton. Did Catherine know about me? That I was working here? The housekeeper shook her head. She died before Henry arranged your hiring. But I think she'd be proud of you. Proud that her granddaughter inherited more than her appearance, that she got her strength and kindness too. Sudden thought occurred to Clara. My mother, Sarah, does she know about Henry and Catherine? Your mother knows her mother loved someone before her father, Mrs. Pemberton replied carefully. But not his identity. Catherine protected that secret her entire life, not from shame but from love. She didn't want her family burdened by knowing what might have been. Clara made a decision. Then we keep it that way. My mother doesn't need to know that her daughter's inheritance comes from her mother's lost love. Some secrets serve the living better by remaining buried. But Thomas looked troubled. Clara, your mother is living modestly while you're about to become one of the wealthiest women in Europe. She'll have questions about why Henry chose you. What do you tell her? It was a valid concern, and Clara hadn't considered the practical implications. I tell her the truth, just not all of it. That Henry appreciated my work and had no one else he trusted with his legacy, which is technically accurate even if incomplete. She looked at Catherine's photograph again, struck by the uncanny resemblance. And if she notices I look like her mother, well, sometimes genetics create strange coincidences. It doesn't have to mean anything. Mrs. Pemberton collected the tea service, her expression suggesting she disagreed, but would respect Clara's decision. Your mother is visiting next week. You should prepare for difficult conversations. Wealth changes relationships, even when people try to prevent it. After the housekeeper left, Clara and Thomas sat together surrounded by evidence of a love story that had shaped their lives before they were born. Do you think Henry actually loved Catherine, or was it just youthful infatuation that he romanticized over decades? Thomas asked, examining photographs with a carpenter's eye for detail. Clara found a letter Catherine had written to Henry 50 years ago, returned unopened per his father's orders, the envelope's seal still intact. I think love that survives 50 years of separation is real, even if it couldn't survive the test of choosing it over comfort when the choice mattered. She held the unopened letter, debating whether reading it would be violation or completion. Should we open it? Thomas asked the question Clara was avoiding. It's not addressed to us, she replied, though curiosity burned. Catherine wrote this to Henry, and he never read it. Opening it now feels like trespassing on private grief. But her fingers traced the seal, and Thomas noticed. You're going to open it anyway, aren't you? Clara smiled despite herself. Probably, because it might contain something important. Some insight into who Catherine was beyond Henry's idealized memory, and understanding her helps me understand the responsibility I've inherited. She broke the seal carefully, unfolding yellowed paper that crackled with age. Catherine's handwriting flowing across the page with the elegance of someone who'd loved books and language. My dearest Henry, the letter began, I received your father's money and your message that we cannot marry, and I want you to know that I understand. Not because I agree with your choice, but because I know the pressure you face from family and society. You were raised to believe that duty to name and fortune matters more than personal happiness, and I cannot fault you for believing what you were taught. The letter continued with devastating grace. I will not pretend this doesn't break my heart, because it does completely and irreparably, but I will survive because survival is what people like me do while people like you inherit empires. I will take your money, build a life, and try to forget the gardens where we dreamed of a future that could never exist. Catherine's words carried no bitterness, only sadness and acceptance. I want you to promise me something, Henry. Promise that you will not waste your life in regret, that you will find happiness with whomever you marry, that you will be kind to your children and teach them that character matters more than wealth, and promise that somewhere, in the quiet moments when you're alone, you will remember that someone loved you for yourself rather than your fortune, and know that love was real even if we couldn't keep it. The letter concluded with a blessing that made Clara weep. Live well, my love, build something meaningful with your inheritance, and perhaps someday fate will be kinder to people like us who had the misfortune of falling in love across boundaries we couldn't cross. I will carry you in my heart until I die, and I will hope that somewhere in heaven, if such a place exists, class distinctions don't matter, and we might finally have the life we dreamed of. With all my love, Catherine. Thomas wiped tears from his own eyes, his voice thick with emotion. She loved him until the end, keeping his photograph, hoping for heavenly reunion, and he spent 50 years in regret knowing he'd abandoned her. It's the saddest love story I've ever heard. Clara folded the letter carefully, returning it to its envelope. But it's not finished, is it? Henry's giving me the chance to write a different ending. To prove that Catherine's granddaughter can use wealth without being corrupted, can choose integrity over expedience, can succeed where he failed. She looked at Thomas, her husband who'd married her when she had nothing, whose love wasn't contingent on inheritance or status. Henry chose cowardice, but I chose you despite knowing it complicated my inheritance. I chose exposing Blackwood despite it being easier to comply. I keep choosing the difficult right thing over the easy wrong thing. Maybe that's Catherine's real legacy, the courage Henry lacked. Thomas pulled her close, his solid warmth anchoring her to reality. Then we honor both their memories by continuing to make those choices, by using this fortune to help people like Catherine who face impossible circumstances, by proving that inheriting wealth doesn't mean inheriting the moral failures that often accompany it. A noise from the hallway made them both tense, and Sebastian stumbled into view, clearly drunk, having apparently broken into the manor through some method security hadn't anticipated. The touching reunion of the maid and her peasant, he slurred, leaning against the doorframe for support. Discussing how virtuous you are while living in luxury stolen from its rightful owners, it's positively nauseating. Clara stood, positioning herself between Sebastian and Thomas, her patience for Whitmore family drama exhausted. Sebastian, you're trespassing. Leave now or I call security and have you arrested. He laughed, the sound harsh and brittle. Security can't arrive before I say what I came to say, which is that we know your secret, Clara. We know why grandfather really chose you, and we're going to make sure everyone knows that you're not some virtuous Cinderella, but the beneficiary of a dead man's obsession with a former mistress. Clara's blood ran cold, understanding that somehow the Whitmores had discovered the Catherine connection. How did you find out? Sebastian produced photographs from his jacket, tossing them onto the desk. Found them in Victoria's safe deposit box. Apparently grandfather wasn't as careful hiding his surveillance of Catherine as he thought. And now the world is going to learn that you're just a replacement for someone who had the good sense to take money and leave rather than pretending to deserve an empire. Thomas moved forward, protective instincts activated, but Clara stopped him. Let him talk. Empty threats are all Sebastian has left. But Sebastian's smile suggested he had more than threats. Victoria's already contacted journalists with the story. By tomorrow morning, every newspaper in Europe will know that Henry Whitmore gave his fortune to his dead mistress's granddaughter in a desperate attempt at redemption, and public opinion is going to turn against you so fast you'll have whiplash. He straightened despite obvious intoxication. No one likes a charity case who pretends they earned it, and you're about to become the most hated woman in Europe. Enjoy your inheritance while you can, because the court of public opinion is about to destroy you. He stumbled away, his drunken laughter echoing through the manor, leaving Clara and Thomas staring at each other in horror. Can they actually do this? Thomas asked, already knowing the answer. Clara thought fast, calculating options and consequences. They can release the story, but we control how it's framed. Edmund can issue statements. We can emphasize Catherine's innocence and Henry's regret. We can turn it from scandal into tragic romance and redemption. But even as she strategized, Clara knew that exposing Catherine's story meant subjecting her grandmother's memory to public scrutiny, dissection, and probably judgment that would pain Catherine's surviving family. My mother, Clara breathed, realizing the implications. She's going to learn that her daughter's inheritance comes from her mother's heartbreak, that her family history is about to become tabloid entertainment. I need to tell her before the story breaks. She deserves to hear it from me. Thomas was already reaching for his phone. I'll call her now. Ask her to come immediately. You'll have a few hours to explain before the media storm hits. As Thomas made the call, Clara gathered the photographs and letters, evidence of a love story that had remained private for 50 years, but was about to become public property, dissected by journalists and judged by people who knew nothing about the people involved. Mrs. Pemberton appeared, having apparently been listening. This is why secrets should stay buried, dear. The truth sometimes causes more pain than comfortable lies. But Clara shook her head, surprising herself with sudden certainty. No, maybe it's time the world knew Henry's story. Not the sanitized version of the brilliant businessman, but the complete truth of a flawed man who made terrible choices and spent his life trying to atone. Maybe that's the real lesson. That wealth doesn't exempt you from moral failure, and that redemption is possible if you're willing to sacrifice everything for it. She looked at Catherine's photograph one final time before securing it safely away. Tomorrow the Whitmores try to destroy me with the truth, but the truth is that Catherine was remarkable, Henry was deeply flawed, and I'm going to use their attempt at scandal as an opportunity to tell a story about love, loss, regret, and redemption that honors both their memories. Thomas ended his call. Your mother is on her way. She'll be here in 3 hours. What are you going to tell her? Clara considered carefully, then smiled with grim determination. Everything, the whole story, and then I'm going to ask her to help me turn what the Whitmores intend as scandal into something beautiful. A public acknowledgement that my grandmother deserved better, that Henry knew it, and that his final act was trying to give Catherine's granddaughter the life he denied Catherine. She stood, gathering resolve. The Whitmores think exposing this secret destroys me, but actually it explains me, validates Henry's choice, and proves that the inheritance was earned not through manipulation, but through inherited character. They're about to make me stronger by trying to tear me down. But as midnight approached and Clara prepared for the conversation with her mother that would change everything, one question remained. Would the public believe the redemption story, or would they see only scandal? And if the court of public opinion turned against her, could she survive the consequences long enough to prove Henry's faith wasn't misplaced? Sarah Morrison arrived at Whitmore Manor at 3 a.m, her silver Volvo crunching gravel in the circular driveway, her 62-year-old face showing confusion mixed with worry as Clara met her at the entrance, the same stone archway where Catherine had once worked decades before. Clara, darling, what's so urgent it couldn't wait until morning? Sarah asked, embracing her daughter with the fierce protectiveness that hadn't diminished despite Clara being a grown woman, her practical wool coat and sensible shoes marking her as someone who'd never sought luxury or pretension. Mrs. Pemberton appeared with fresh coffee, her presence steady as always, and Clara guided her mother to Henry's study where evidence of a 50-year-old love story waited to rewrite family history. Mum, there's something I need to tell you about Grandma Catherine, about why Henry Whitmore left me his fortune, and it's going to be difficult to hear, Clara began, her voice already trembling with anticipation of pain she was about to cause. Sarah set down her coffee cup, a mother's instinct sensing something profound. Your grandmother is involved in this inheritance? Clara, what are you talking about? She was a simple bookshop owner who died 3 years ago. How could she possibly be connected to a billionaire? Thomas stood near the window, providing silent support, while Clara laid out photographs showing young Catherine and young Henry together in gardens that still existed outside the very room where they sat. Grandma Catherine worked as a maid here in the 1970s, Clara explained gently, watching her mother's expression shift from confusion to dawning comprehension. And she fell in love with Henry Whitmore, the heir to this estate. They had a secret relationship for 3 years. Sarah picked up a photograph with shaking hands, studying the young woman who was undeniably her mother, smiling with an openness Sarah had never seen in the sadness-touched woman who'd raised her. She never told me, never mentioned working here or knowing anyone named Whitmore. Why would she keep that secret? Clara handed her mother Henry's narrative, the confession he'd written knowing it would eventually surface. Because it ended badly, Mum. Henry's father discovered their relationship and forced a choice. £1 million for Catherine to leave and never contact Henry again, or social destruction for both of them if they tried to marry across class boundaries. Her mother read silently, tears forming as she absorbed the story of a love that ended in pragmatic separation rather than romantic triumph. So my mother loved this man, took his money, and left him? Sarah's voice carried hurt and confusion. She used the money to build a life. She married Dad, opened her bookshop, and by all accounts lived happily, Clara continued, pulling out more photographs showing Catherine's life after leaving Whitmore Manor, surveillance images that Henry had collected over decades. But she never forgot Henry. She kept his photograph in a locket her entire life, and she visited this estate 6 months before she died, walking through the gardens one last time. Sarah's hands trembled, coffee forgotten. The locket, the one she left you, with the photograph of the man she never identified, that was him? That was Henry Whitmore. Clara nodded, pulling the silver locket from around her neck, opening it to show both photographs. Young Henry and young Catherine, eternal and unchanging. And Henry spent 50 years regretting his choice, watching Catherine from a distance, documenting her life, carrying the guilt of choosing money and status over love. The study fell silent except for the grandfather clock's steady ticking, measuring moments as Sarah processed revelations that recontextualized her mother's entire life. So he gave you his fortune out of guilt? Sarah asked, her tone difficult to read. He gave it to me because I remind him of Catherine, because I'm her granddaughter, and because he hoped that giving me what he denied her might somehow balance the scales for his cowardice 50 years ago, Clara explained, aware of how inadequate this summary felt. But also because he spent 5 years watching me work here, testing my character, ensuring I'd inherited Catherine's values rather than just her appearance. Sarah stood abruptly, pacing the study like a caged animal, her practical nature struggling against romantic revelation. This is insane, Clara. You're telling me that my daughter is a billionaire because my mother had her heart broken by a man who chose money over her, and somehow that's supposed to be romantic rather than tragic. Thomas spoke for the first time, his quiet voice carrying weight. It's both, Mrs. Morrison. It's tragic that they couldn't be together, and romantic that their love survived 50 years of separation, and complicated because Henry's final act was trying to atone for his greatest mistake. Sarah turned on him, her grief finding a target. And who are you to judge my mother's pain? You're the carpenter who married my daughter when she was a maid, probably thought you'd won the lottery when she inherited billions. How convenient for you. Clara stood, her voice sharp. Mum, stop. Thomas married me before anyone knew about the inheritance. He supported me through everything, and attacking him because you're upset about Grandma isn't fair or accurate. Her mother's anger deflated, replaced by tears that had been building since she'd started reading. I'm sorry, Thomas, that was cruel. How do I process that my mother lived her entire life carrying this secret? That she was sad because of something I never knew about? That she died without telling me the truth? Clara guided her mother to the leather sofa, sitting beside her in a reversal of countless childhood moments when Sarah had comforted Clara's hurts. Maybe she didn't tell you because she didn't want you to see her as a victim. She built a beautiful life despite heartbreak. She was happy with Dad, proud of you. And the secret was hers to keep, not a burden to pass on. Sarah wiped tears with the practical handkerchief she always carried. Did she know about you working here? Did Henry arrange it? Henry arranged my hiring after Catherine died, Clara confirmed. So no, she never knew I was working in the same house where she'd once worked, never knew that her lost love was watching her granddaughter. It's purely coincidence from her perspective. Her mother laughed bitterly. Coincidence, fate, manipulation, call it what you want. But my daughter is wealthy because of my mother's tragedy, and I don't know how to feel about that except angry at a dead man who can't defend his choices. Mrs. Pemberton, who'd been standing sentinel near the door, spoke with the authority of decades. Mrs. Morrison, if I may, I knew both Catherine and Henry, saw them together when they were young, and I can tell you that what they had was real, rare, and worth. Mourning, Henry's choice was cowardly, but his regret was genuine, and his final act was trying to give Catherine's granddaughter everything he'd denied Catherine. She moved to sit opposite Sarah. Your mother wasn't a victim. She was a survivor who built a beautiful life from heartbreak, and she'd be proud of Clara for handling this impossible inheritance with grace and integrity. Sarah looked at the housekeeper with new interest. You knew my mother? You worked here when she did. I was assistant housekeeper then, just 20 years old, and Catherine was my friend, Mrs. Pemberton confirmed, her stern face softening with memory. She was kind, intelligent, and deeply in love with a young man who wasn't strong enough to choose her. But she didn't let that destroy her. She grieved. Then she moved forward, which is what strong women do. Clara handed her mother Catherine's letter to Henry, the one he'd never read. Grandma wrote this when she left. It's beautiful and heartbreaking, and it shows exactly who she was, someone who loved deeply but didn't demand that her pain become someone else's burden. Sarah read her mother's words, and Clara watched understanding replace anger, grief transform into something like pride. She was extraordinary, Sarah whispered, finishing the letter. She loved him but released him, built a life but never forgot him. How did she carry all of this alone? Maybe she didn't, Clara suggested gently. Maybe Dad knew. Maybe she had friends who understood. Maybe the bookshop was her therapy, creating a space filled with love stories that ended better than hers. We'll never know all of it, but we know she survived and thrived despite heartbreak. Sarah looked at her daughter with new understanding. And now you're supposed to do what? Use this fortune to vindicate her memory? Prove that her granddaughter can handle wealth that Henry couldn't give her? That's enormous pressure, Clara. It is, Clara agreed. But it's also an opportunity to honor her by using wealth the way she would have, helping people, creating opportunities, proving that character matters more than money. Henry gave me a choice he couldn't make, and I'm choosing differently. Her mother stood, moving to examine photographs of Catherine spread across the desk, studying a woman she'd known as Mother, but clearly hadn't fully understood. There's more you haven't told me, Sarah said with maternal intuition. What else is coming that required this 3 a.m. confession? Clara exchanged glances with Thomas, then explained about the Whitmores' plan to expose the story publicly. The journalists already contacted, the scandal breaking within hours. By tomorrow morning, Grandma's story becomes public property, dissected by strangers, probably sensationalized, and I wanted you to hear the truth from me before tabloids turn it into entertainment. Sarah's expression hardened, the practical woman who'd raised Clara alone after her father's death reasserting control. So Victoria Whitmore is trying to destroy you by destroying my mother's reputation? Making her heartbreak into scandal. That's the plan, Clara confirmed. Frame the inheritance as creepy obsession rather than tragic romance. Suggest I manipulated a lonely old man. Imply that Catherine was somehow improper. Whatever narrative makes me look worst. Her mother laughed, surprising everyone. Then Victoria Whitmore doesn't understand how this works. The British public loves tragic romance, especially when it involves class barriers and lifelong regret. Properly framed, this makes you sympathetic rather than suspicious, and makes my mother a romantic heroine rather than a victim. Clara felt hope spark. You'd help me frame it? Even though it means Grandma's privacy being violated. Sarah squared her shoulders, and Clara saw the strength that had sustained her mother through widowhood, financial struggle, and single parenthood. My mother kept this secret to protect people she loved, but those people are dead now. And if telling her story protects you and honors her memory, then yes, I'll help. But we tell the truth, Clara, all of it, including Henry's cowardice, because sanitizing it dishonors everyone involved. Mrs. Pemberton smiled approvingly. Catherine would be proud of you, Sarah. That's exactly what she'd say. Over the next 3 hours, as dawn broke over the Whitmore estate, Clara, Sarah, Thomas, and Mrs. Pemberton worked with Edmund Cross and a crisis management team to craft a narrative that honored Catherine's memory while defending Clara's inheritance. We lead with the romance, Edmund advised, reviewing press statements. Young love torn apart by class barriers and family pressure, a theme that resonates across cultures and generations. Then we emphasize Catherine's strength, how she built a beautiful life despite heartbreak. Sarah added details only a daughter would know. She donated thousands of pounds to literacy charities, funded scholarships for working-class students, used her bookshop as a community center for people who couldn't afford entertainment. Everything she did reflected values that Clara's now using on a larger scale. The crisis manager, a sharp woman named Diana Reed, nodded approvingly. Perfect, we're showing inherited character, proving that Clara deserves this fortune not through manipulation but through genetic legacy of integrity. The Whitmores wanted to use this as scandal, but we're turning it into validation. By 7 a.m., statements were prepared, journalists friendly to their narrative were briefed, and photographs of young Catherine and Henry were ready for release with family permission. The story breaks in 2 hours, Diana reported, monitoring social media and news feeds. Victoria's version is already circulating in gossip channels, but it's thin on details and heavy on innuendo. We're going to flood the zone with the complete story, backed by evidence, before their narrative solidifies. Sarah looked at her daughter with fierce pride. Your grandmother survived heartbreak and built something beautiful. You're surviving attacks and building something even bigger. She'd be so proud of you, Clara. Clara embraced her mother, feeling generational strength flowing between them. I'm proud of her, Mum, and I promise I'll use this fortune to honor her memory, create opportunities for people like her who face impossible circumstances, prove that the working class deserves respect and resources. Thomas's phone buzzed with a news alert. It's starting. The Daily Mail just published Victoria's version. Billionaire's obsession. How a maid's granddaughter inherited a fortune through dead lover's guilt. Diana read the article quickly, her expression grim. They're emphasizing the surveillance aspect, making Henry look creepy and Clara opportunistic. Quotes from family sources suggesting you manipulated him in his final years. It's exactly as expected, but still damaging. Sarah read over Diana's shoulder, her expression darkening. They're calling my mother a mistress and suggesting she extorted money from Henry. That's libel, and we're going to destroy them for it. Edmund nodded. We will, but first we counter with the truth, Diana. Release our statement and photographs. Let's see how their narrative holds up against actual evidence and family testimony. Within minutes, the counter-narrative flooded news cycles. Photographs of young Catherine and Henry, Sarah's testimony about her mother's character, Mrs. Pemberton's corroboration as someone who'd known them both, and Clara's statement emphasizing her determination to honor Catherine's values through ethical wealth management. The social media response is immediate, Diana reported, monitoring Twitter and Instagram. Public sentiment is shifting rapidly. People are calling it the most romantic tragedy since Romeo and Juliet, criticizing the Whitmore family for attacking Clara, and praising Catherine for her dignity in impossible circumstances. Sarah watched trending hashtags appear. Hashtag justice for Catherine, hashtag classism kills, hashtag Clara deserves it. The court of public opinion rendering judgment far faster than any legal proceeding. Your grandmother is becoming a symbol, Mrs. Pemberton observed with satisfaction, representing everyone who's ever loved someone above their station or been judged for not having the right background. Victoria's attempt at scandal is backfiring spectacularly. But Diana's expression remained cautious. We're winning the initial narrative battle, but the Whitmores will counterattack. They'll find people to question Catherine's character, suggest the relationship was different than we're claiming, try to undermine the romance angle. She proved prescient when Victoria appeared on morning television, her composed face betraying desperation. This romantic narrative is convenient fiction, Victoria told the sympathetic interviewer. The truth is that my father was a lonely, elderly man who became obsessed with a dead woman he'd briefly known decades ago, and her granddaughter exploited that obsession to steal our family's legacy. The interviewer, clearly briefed by Diana, pushed back. But Mrs. Whitmore, we have photographs, letters, and testimony from multiple sources confirming the relationship. Are you suggesting all of this is fabricated? Victoria's composure cracked. I'm suggesting that a maid's granddaughter had no business inheriting billions while my father's actual children and grandchildren were left with comparative pittance. It's obscene, it's wrong, and it needs to be corrected. Sarah, watching from the study, laughed without humor. She's making it about money rather than love, proving exactly why Henry didn't trust her with his fortune. She can't even pretend to understand that some things matter more than inheritance. The television interview deteriorated further as Victoria inadvertently revealed her own greed, complaining about the insulting €1 million she'd received while some nobody inherited hundreds of millions. She's destroying herself on live television, Thomas observed, every word confirming that she sees wealth as entitlement rather than responsibility. Diana's phone exploded with messages. Public sentiment is overwhelmingly against Victoria. She's being eviscerated on social media for calling Clara a nobody. The classism is too blatant, and now Catherine is being defended not just as a romantic figure, but as representative of all working-class people dismissed by the wealthy. Clara watched the narrative shift in real time, from potential scandal to a referendum on class, inheritance, and whether love matters more than bloodline. Henry knew this would happen, she realized suddenly. He knew the family would attack, knew the story would become public, and he trusted that the truth would vindicate his choice. He was playing a long game even from beyond the grave. Edmund agreed. Everything he did, the documentation, the evidence, the letter explaining his reasoning, it was all designed to support you when this moment arrived. He couldn't defend you himself. so he created weapons you could use against the family he knew would attack. By noon, the narrative war was essentially won. Victoria's television appearance had backfired so completely that other Whitmores distanced themselves publicly, and Catherine's story had become a cultural touchstone about love, class, and the courage to build a life from heartbreak. "You've won the public opinion battle," Diana confirmed. Catherine's being celebrated as a working-class hero, Henry's seen as a tragic figure who tried to atone for cowardice, and you're viewed as the worthy inheritor of both their legacies. The Whitmores can't touch you now without looking even worse. Sarah hugged her daughter, tears flowing freely. "Your grandmother would be overwhelmed by this, her private pain becoming public inspiration. I think she'd be embarrassed but also secretly pleased that her story matters to so many people." Clara felt the weight of public expectation replacing private doubt. "Now I have to live up to it, prove that I deserve this platform, use the fortune the way Catherine would have wanted. I can't just talk about honoring her values. I have to demonstrate them." Thomas squeezed her hand. "You already are. Every decision you've made since inheriting has proven Henry right to trust you. This public validation just confirms what people close to you already knew." But Mrs. Pemberton's expression remained concerned. "The immediate battle is won, but wars have many battles. The Whitmores won't stop just because public sentiment turned against them. They'll regroup, find new strategies, and continue fighting. You need to remain vigilant." Edmund nodded agreement. "Victoria's already retained new lawyers. Marcus is reportedly meeting with business partners about strategies to undermine Whitmore Industries, and Sebastian's gambling debts suggest he'll be desperate enough to try something foolish. This is far from over." Sarah looked around the study where her mother had once worked, where Catherine and Henry had stolen moments together, where 50 years of regret had accumulated before finally finding release. "My mother lived with heartbreak for 50 years but never let it destroy her dignity or compassion. You're inheriting that strength, Clara, along with the money. Use both wisely." As afternoon settled over Whitmore Manor, Clara stood in the gardens where Catherine and Henry had once walked, her mother beside her, both women contemplating the choices and chances that had led to this moment. "Do you think they're together now?" Sarah asked, the question carrying hope rather than certainty. "If there's an afterlife, do you think they finally got the happy ending they couldn't have here?" Clara thought of Catherine keeping Henry's photograph for 50 years, of Henry watching Catherine from a distance, of two people who'd loved each other, but couldn't overcome the barriers between them. "I hope so, Mum. I really do. And I hope they're watching now, seeing that their story mattered, that Catherine's values survived through you to me, that Henry's final act created something good from decades of regret." They stood together as the sun moved across gardens maintained by groundskeepers who now knew the romance that had bloomed among those roses, and Clara felt the weight of 3 generations settling on her shoulders. "So what happens next?" Sarah asked the question everyone was wondering. Clara looked at the manor, at the business empire, at the fortune that came with strings attached to the past and responsibilities extending into the future. "Next we show the world what Catherine's granddaughter can do with a billionaire's guilt and a maid's integrity," she said with growing conviction. "We build something that would make them both proud, something that proves love and character matter more than money or status, something that transforms a tragic romance into lasting legacy." But even as determination filled her, Clara knew that the Whitmores' next attack would come from a direction she hadn't anticipated, that winning the public narrative didn't mean winning the war, and that somewhere in the vast empire she now controlled, secrets still waited to surface. What other traps had Henry's family set before his death? What other vulnerabilities existed in the corporate structure? And would Clara be strong enough to survive what came next while honoring both Catherine's memory and the public's expectations? What would you do if the people who wanted to destroy you had absolutely nothing left to lose? Clara stood in the Whitmore Industries boardroom exactly 1 week after Catherine's story went public, facing Margaret Chun and the newly restructured executive team, when her phone buzzed with a message that made her blood freeze. "Your husband has been in an accident, St. Mary's Hospital, come immediately." The meeting dissolved into chaos as Clara bolted for the door, Thomas's name tearing from her throat, Edmund and David racing after her while Margaret coordinated with security, everyone understanding instinctively that this was no accident. The Mercedes Edmund had insisted Clara use screeched through London traffic, her mind spinning through worst-case scenarios, Thomas's kind face haunting every thought, the realization that she'd been so focused on corporate battles that she'd left him vulnerable, crashing down with suffocating weight. "He's alive. Edmund kept repeating, phone pressed to his ear coordinating with hospital staff. They say he's alive, Clara, hold on to that. But alive could mean so many things, and Clara's imagination filled the gaps with horrors. St. Mary's emergency entrance appeared like a nightmare's gateway, fluorescent lights harsh against gathering dusk, and Clara ran through automatic doors with the desperation of someone whose world had just tilted toward collapse. Thomas Bennett, she gasped at the reception desk, barely coherent, carpenter 30s, came in by ambulance. Where is he? A nurse guided her to a private waiting room where Detective Hartley stood with grim expression, his presence confirming Clara's worst suspicions. Mrs. Bennett, your husband is in surgery. A vehicle struck him while he was walking near the construction site where he's been working, Hartley explained, his detective's neutrality failing to mask concern. The driver fled the scene, but witnesses reported a black Range Rover with tinted windows, no plates visible. Clara's legs buckled and Edmund caught her, guiding her to a plastic chair that felt impossibly hard and real. This wasn't an accident, was it? She asked, though she already knew. Hartley's expression confirmed it. The vehicle appeared to wait for your husband specifically, struck him with enough force to throw him 15 feet, then accelerated away before anyone could react. This was deliberate, targeted, and professional. The words professional echoed with implications that made Clara want to vomit. The Whitmores hired someone to kill my husband because they couldn't destroy me legally or through public opinion? Edmund pulled out his phone, already coordinating with security and legal teams. We don't have proof yet, but the timing is suspicious. Victoria's lawyers filed another motion to contest the will yesterday. It was dismissed immediately, and Marcus has been unusually quiet since his business partners distanced themselves. Desperation makes people dangerous. A surgeon emerged, still in. Scrubs with exhaustion and concern etched on her face. Mrs. Bennett? I'm Dr. Patel. Your husband sustained multiple injuries, including a fractured pelvis, broken ribs, punctured lung, and significant internal bleeding. We've stabilized him, but the next 48 hours are critical. Clara forced herself to focus, to understand through the terror. Can I see him? He's in intensive care, heavily sedated. But yes, for a few minutes. Dr. Patel replied with professional compassion that had clearly been refined through thousands of similar conversations. The ICU was a cathedral to human fragility, machines beeping steady rhythms that meant life continued, and Thomas lay pale and broken among wires and tubes, his strong carpenter's body reduced to something terrifyingly vulnerable. I'm so sorry, Clara whispered, taking his hand carefully to avoid the 4 lines. This is my fault. You married a maid and now you're here because I inherited a fortune you never wanted. I'm so sorry, Thomas. His eyes remained closed, morphine keeping him mercifully unconscious. And Clara sat beside him while nurses monitored and machines beeped, and the world continued despite everything feeling utterly stopped. Mrs. Bennett, a nurse touched her shoulder gently after what might have been minutes or hours. You need to step out while we do some procedures, but you can return shortly. He's stable. That's what matters now. Back in the waiting room, Clara found not just Edmund and Hartley but Sarah, Mrs. Pemberton, David, and Margaret, a chosen family assembled in crisis. How is he? Her mother asked, embracing Clara with fierce protectiveness. Alive barely, Clara replied, the words hollow. And this is my fault. I brought him into this nightmare by inheriting money that should have gone to people who'd have used it to destroy rather than build. Sarah gripped her daughter's shoulders, forcing eye contact. Listen to me, Clara Morrison Bennett, you did nothing wrong. Evil people did evil things because they're evil, not because you exist, not because you inherited wealth, because they chose violence over accepting that they lost. Do you understand? But guilt wasn't rational, and Clara couldn't shake the feeling that Thomas lay broken because she dared to accept Henry's impossible gift. Hartley cleared his throat, his detective's mask firmly in place. Mrs. Bennett, I need to ask you some questions about the Whitmore family's recent activities, specifically whether you've received any threats or noticed suspicious behavior. Clara forced her mind to focus. Sebastian broke into the manor 2 weeks ago, drunk and threatening. Security removed him, but he said we'd pay for humiliating the family. And Victoria's been increasingly erratic since the Catherine story went public. Does that help? The detective made notes. Sebastian Whitmore has a history of violence when intoxicated, 2 assault charges that were settled quietly, and he's accumulated gambling debts exceeding £2 million in the past 6 months. Desperate and violent is a dangerous combination. Edmund's phone rang, and his expression darkened as he listened. That was our security chief. Sebastian's credit card was used to rent a black Range Rover 3 days ago. He returned it this morning claiming he'd scraped the bumper on a parking garage wall. The pieces assembled with horrifying clarity. Sebastian tried to kill my husband over gambling debts and inheritance he'll never receive? Clara asked, the senselessness of it overwhelming. Or Marcus paid him to do it, Hartley suggested, his detective's mind working through possibilities. Sebastian's desperate enough to accept money for violence, and Marcus has motive to hurt you through your husband. Either scenario results in the same crime, attempted murder for hire. Margaret spoke up, her CFO's precision applying to criminal analysis. After you exposed the corporate conspiracy, Marcus lost his business partnerships and income streams. He's facing bankruptcy and potential prosecution. And men like Marcus don't handle losing gracefully, they lash out. David added information from his corporate intelligence sources. Marcus met with Sebastian twice in the past week at locations he thought weren't monitored. Our security team photographed them, but couldn't capture audio. If they were planning this attack, they tried to be careful. Mrs. Pemberton, who'd been uncharacteristically silent, spoke with quiet fury. These people disgust me. I've worked for the Whitmore family for 40 years. Watched them grow from spoiled children into corrupt adults. But attempted murder crosses a line even I didn't think they'd approach. Henry would be devastated knowing his blood tried to kill an innocent man. Clara felt rage replacing grief, a cold fury that crystallized into determination. Then we destroy them completely and permanently. We use every resource at our disposal to ensure Sebastian and Marcus face full legal consequences. And we make certain the Whitmore name becomes synonymous with everything Henry tried to atone for. Edmund nodded approvingly. Good, anger is more useful than guilt. I'll coordinate with Hartley's investigation, provide evidence of the Range Rover rental and Marcus's meetings with Sebastian, and Judith Blackstone will prepare civil suits for attempted murder conspiracy. Hartley held up a cautionary hand. I appreciate the cooperation, but let me be clear. We need evidence that would convince a jury, not just corporate surveillance and financial records. Sebastian renting a vehicle isn't proof he used it to commit attempted murder, and Marcus meeting his cousin isn't proof of conspiracy. Clara understood the detective's caution, but her patience for legal niceties had evaporated. Then what do we need? A confession? Video of them planning the attack? Because I'll get it, whatever it takes. Sarah gripped her daughter's arm. Clara, don't do anything stupid. You can't help Thomas if you're in jail for vigilante justice. But Clara's mind was already working through possibilities, remembering techniques Henry had used to document his family's crimes. We don't need vigilante justice. We need them to incriminate themselves. Sebastian's desperate and probably terrified he'll be caught, and Marcus is arrogant enough to believe he's untouchable. Those are exploitable weaknesses. David leaned forward, understanding dawning. You want to wire someone and get them talking? That's dangerous, Clara. If they suspect a setup, they might turn violent. Then we make sure they don't suspect, Clara replied, her strategic mind engaging despite exhaustion. Sebastian drinks a lot, drunk people talk, and Marcus's ego means he likes explaining how clever he is. We use those character flaws against them. Edmund looked uncomfortable, but didn't object. What are you proposing specifically? Clara outlined a plan formed from desperation and rage. Arrange for Sebastian to receive an anonymous payment of £50,000 with a note suggesting Marcus had hired him to send a message, making Sebastian believe he'd been paid for the attack and was clear. He'll go drinking to celebrate, probably brag to someone about the easy money. And if that someone is wearing a wire and knows how to prompt confessions, we get what we need. Hartley's expression suggested he shouldn't be hearing this, but wasn't stopping it. And who exactly would this wired person be? Me, David volunteered immediately. Sebastian knows me from corporate events. Thinks I'm a minor executive he can impress. I've heard him brag before when he's drunk, and I'm willing to wear a wire if it means putting him away. Margaret shook her head. Too dangerous. Sebastian's violent when intoxicated. What if he realizes you're recording and attacks? But David's expression showed determination. Then Detective Hartley has backup nearby and intervenes before permanent damage occurs. It's a calculated risk I'm willing to take. The plan was dangerous, possibly illegal, and entirely necessary given that traditional justice seemed inadequate against people with Whitmore resources. I can't officially sanction this, Hartley said carefully, but if a private citizen happened to record a conversation with someone who voluntarily confessed to crimes, that recording would be admissible evidence. And if that private citizen felt threatened during said conversation and called for police assistance, we'd respond immediately. It was the closest to approval they'd receive, and Clara felt grim satisfaction at having a concrete action plan. What about Marcus? Sebastian might implicate himself, but Marcus is smarter, more careful. Edmund considered this. Marcus's weakness is his need to feel superior, especially to people he considers beneath him. If someone he perceives as inferior confronted him with evidence of Sebastian's confession, he might reveal his involvement to assert dominance and control. Sarah looked horrified. You're suggesting Clara confront a man who just tried to kill her husband? Absolutely not, I forbid it. But Clara stood, resolve hardening like steel. Mum, I appreciate your concern, but Thomas is in that ICU because Marcus Whitmore couldn't accept losing, and I won't let him escape consequences by being too afraid to confront him. If wearing a wire and making him confess is what's needed, then that's what I'll do. The room erupted in objections, but Clara silenced them with raised hand. Everyone stop. This isn't a democracy. Thomas is my husband. The Whitmores attacked him to hurt me, and I'm going to ensure they face justice by whatever means necessary now. Either help me or stay out of my way. Mrs. Pemberton smiled, a fierce expression that transformed her stern face. Catherine would be proud of you, dear. You've inherited her strength along with her appearance. Count me in for whatever you need. Over the next 6 hours, while Thomas remained in critical but stable condition, Clara's team assembled the components of a sting operation that would have made Henry proud. David received coaching from private investigators about how to prompt confessions without appearing suspicious. Clara practiced maintaining composure while confronting someone she wanted to destroy, and Edmund coordinated with Hartley to ensure police backup would be positioned but not visible. The $50,000 goes into Sebastian's account tomorrow morning, Edmund reported. The note says for services rendered, discretion appreciated. Vague enough to apply to various interpretations, but specific enough that Sebastian will assume it's payment for the hit. Margaret added financial intelligence. We're tracking Sebastian's movements. He frequents 3 bars regularly, and based on his pattern, he'll go to the Crown and Anchor tomorrow evening, upscale enough for his pretensions, but dark enough for indiscretion. David would intercept Sebastian at the bar, a chance encounter between acquaintances by drinks, and gradually steer conversation toward money and recent good fortune. The key is making him want to brag, the private investigator explained. Men like Sebastian need external validation, especially when they've done something they consider clever. If David seems impressed rather than judgmental, Sebastian will elaborate. For Clara's confrontation with Marcus, the approach required more finesse. Marcus works late at his office, private building with minimal security. If you arrive unannounced with Sebastian's recorded confession, his arrogance will make him want to explain how he orchestrated everything, Edmund outlined. But if he realizes you're recording? Sarah asked, her concern undiminished. He won't. We're using devices designed for corporate espionage, completely undetectable without electronic sweeps. Marcus won't think to perform, Edmund assured, though his expression suggested doubt about the entire plan. Clara returned to the ICU where Thomas remained unconscious, his condition unchanged, machines still beeping their mechanical reassurance. I'm going to get them, she whispered, holding his hand gently. The people who did this will face justice, I promise you. And then we're going to use Henry's fortune exactly as planned, helping people, creating opportunities, proving that good can triumph over evil even when evil fights dirty. His hand remained limp, offering no response, but Clara imagined understanding in his stillness. The next evening arrived with agonizing slowness, Thomas's condition stable but not improving, creating a terrible limbo where hope and despair battled continuously. David entered the Crown and Anchor at 8 p.m., Clara and Edmund monitoring from a van outside, while Hartley positioned undercover officers throughout the bar. Sebastian just arrived. David's voice came through the wire, slightly distorted but clear. Ordering his 3rd scotch, looks celebratory. This might actually work. Clara listened as David executed the planned encounter. Fake surprise at seeing Sebastian, casual conversation about work, gradually steering toward money. You seem in good spirits, David observed, the conversation captured by multiple recording devices. Sebastian's laugh was loose with alcohol. Had some unexpected income recently, finally getting what I deserve after years of being treated like the family embarrassment. David played his role perfectly, impressed curiosity without suspicion. Good for you, everyone could use a financial break. What happened? Inheritance come through. Better than inheritance, Sebastian slurred. drunk enough to be careless. Got paid for doing something that needed doing anyway, sending a message to people who need to understand there are consequences for stealing. Clara's hands clenched into fists, hearing confirmation that Thomas had been deliberately targeted. David prompted gently. Sounds mysterious, like something from a movie. Sebastian leaned closer, his voice dropping to conspiratorial whisper that the sensitive equipment captured clearly. Between us? Marcus hired me to teach the carpenter a lesson, nothing fatal, just enough to scare Clara into selling her shares and disappearing. But the idiot stepped wrong and took more damage than intended. He laughed without humor. Marcus was pissed about the hospital part, worried about murder charges, but 50 grand is 50 grand, and the cops have nothing concrete. David maintained his impressed facade. Marcus Whitmore paid you $50,000 to run down Clara's husband? That's intense. Marcus wanted to hire professionals, but they cost 10 times as much, Sebastian continued, alcohol destroying whatever discretion remained. So I did it cheaper, borrowed a Range Rover under fake credentials, waited outside the construction site, and boom, problem solved, or would have been if the carpenter hadn't survived. Clara felt sick hearing Thomas's near-death described so casually, but satisfaction warred with nausea, knowing they had Sebastian's full confession recorded. You're not worried about getting caught? David asked, the question designed to elicit more detail. Sebastian waved dismissively. Marcus paid cash, no electronic trail. The Range Rover was returned with fake damage explanation, and without video evidence or witnesses who got the plate number. There's nothing to connect me. It's the perfect crime. David glanced toward the bar's entrance, where Hartley's signal indicated sufficient evidence had been gathered. That's pretty clever, Sebastian. You covered your bases well. Damn right I did, Sebastian replied, ordering another drink. Marcus thinks he's the smart one, but I'm the one who had the guts to actually act. He just writes checks and plans. I'm the one who. Hartley's team moved simultaneously, 3 plainclothes officers surrounding Sebastian before he could process what was happening. Sebastian Whitmore, you're under arrest for attempted murder and conspiracy, Hartley announced, his voice carrying satisfaction. You have the right to remain silent, though you've already said quite enough. Sebastian's drunk face transformed from smug to terrified as handcuffs clicked around his wrists. This is entrapment. You can't use any of that. Actually, you voluntarily confessed to someone you believed was a friend, in a public location with no coercion, Hartley replied. Entirely admissible, and your cousin Marcus is about to have a very bad evening. In the van, Clara felt grim triumph mixed with lingering rage. One down now, Marcus. Edmund handed her the recording device, disguised as an expensive pen. Are you absolutely certain about this? Marcus is dangerous, especially when cornered. Clara thought of Thomas lying in ICU, of Catherine's lifetime of heartbreak, of Henry's 50 years of regret, of all the people the Whitmores had hurt through their entitled cruelty. I'm certain, let's finish this. Marcus Whitmore's office occupied the penthouse of a building his investment firm had once owned before financial difficulties forced downsizing, his diminished circumstances evident in dated furniture and absent staff. Clara entered using Edmund's security credentials, finding Marcus at his desk reviewing documents that probably represented his collapsing business empire. Clara, he said without surprise, suggesting he'd been expecting confrontation. Come to gloat about destroying my career? Or perhaps to offer a settlement that prevents further legal action? Clara sat across from him, maintaining composure despite wanting to leap across the desk. Actually, I'm here to inform you that Sebastian was arrested an hour ago for attempting to murder my husband, and during arrest he provided quite detailed confession about who hired him. Marcus's expression remained neutral, impressive control that revealed nothing. How unfortunate for Sebastian, though I'm not sure what that has to do with me. Clara played the recording, Sebastian's voice filling the office with damning detail about Marcus's planning and payment, every word another nail in the conspiracy coffin. That's what it has to do with you, Clara said when the recording ended. Sebastian confessed to being hired by you, confirmed receiving £50,000 in cash, and described your anger when Thomas survived with injuries rather than dying quietly. Marcus stood, moving to the window overlooking London's night skyline, his silence stretching uncomfortably. Sebastian's drunk confession isn't credible evidence. Any lawyer would demolish it by highlighting his intoxication, gambling debts, and motive to lie. Clara leaned forward. Perhaps, but combined with surveillance photos of you meeting Sebastian 3 times before the attack, The financial records Edmonds already provided showing cash withdrawals matching the amount Sebastian claimed, and testimony from multiple witnesses about your deteriorating mental state since losing your business partnerships. It becomes quite compelling. She paused, letting implications settle. And that's before we discuss the civil case, where burden of proof is lower than criminal court. I'll own whatever assets you have left by the time my lawyers finish. Marcus turned from the window, and Clara saw something. Crack in his composure. You've destroyed everything my grandfather built, corrupted his legacy with your working-class morality and misguided attempts at redemption. You should have taken the original settlement offer and disappeared. But instead you've made yourself an enemy of people who don't lose gracefully. Clara stood, matching his height despite her smaller frame. Henry didn't build an empire for entitled children to loot. He built it hoping his family would value responsibility over privilege, character over connections, and when you proved incapable of that, he gave it to someone who understood what actually matters. Your inheritance was earned through birthright. Mine was earned through being a decent human being. And watching you face consequences for attempted murder will be personally satisfying. Marcus's mask dropped completely, revealing the rage beneath. You think you've won? Sebastian will claim he lied. My lawyers will create reasonable doubt. And even if convicted, I'll serve minimal time because people like us don't go to real prison. Meanwhile, you'll spend millions on legal fees, suffer media scrutiny, and watch your marriage crumble under pressure. Thomas will never fully recover, physically or emotionally. And you'll spend your life knowing that accepting this inheritance cost you the one person who loved you before the money. The cruelty was calculated to wound, and Clara felt its impact despite expecting attacks. Perhaps, she acknowledged, but at least I'll spend that life knowing I fought for justice, rather than accepting that wealthy people can commit crimes without consequences. Henry spent 50 years tolerating your family's corruption. I won't make that mistake. Marcus moved suddenly, crossing the distance between them with predatory speed, and Clara realized too late that cornering a desperate man was more dangerous than she'd calculated. You self-righteous little bitch, he hissed, his hand closing around her throat. You've cost me everything, and I'll be damned if you walk out of here thinking you've won. Clara couldn't breathe, couldn't call for help, her vision darkening as Marcus's grip tightened, and she understood with terrible clarity that her plan had failed, that she'd underestimated how far desperation would drive someone, that Thomas might wake to find her dead. The office door burst open, and Hartley entered with 2 officers, weapons drawn, their response instant and professional. Release her now, Marcus, or we will use force. Marcus's hand remained on Clara's throat for an eternal second before releasing, and she collapsed gasping for air while officers restrained him. That's assault witnessed by 3 police officers, Hartley announced. Added to conspiracy to commit murder based on Sebastian's confession and this recording of your threatening statements. You're done, Marcus. As officers led Marcus away, his parting words carried venom. This isn't over, Clara. The Whitmore family has resources you can't imagine, and will make you regret every decision that brought you here. Hartley helped Clara to her feet, his expression mixing concern and frustration. That was incredibly stupid and reckless. He could have killed you before we breached the door. Clara rubbed her bruised throat, her voice raspy. But he didn't, and now you have assault charges to add to the conspiracy. Was it worth the risk? Ask Thomas when he wakes up. The detective couldn't argue with results, though his disapproval remained evident. Edmund arrived with legal documents already prepared. Sebastian and Marcus are both in custody. Bail will be set prohibitively high given flight risk and violence. And between the confession recording and assault witnessed by police, prosecution has overwhelming evidence. Clara returned to St. Mary's Hospital where Sarah waited with news. Thomas had regained consciousness, groggy and in pain but alive and aware. He's asking for you, her mother reported, embracing Clara with relief. Thomas looked small in the hospital bed, his strong frame diminished by injury and medication. But his eyes found Clara with recognition and love that made her weep. Hey, he whispered, his voice weak. I hear I missed some excitement. Clara took his hand carefully, mindful of IVs and monitors. You miss me being an idiot and nearly getting killed confronting Marcus, but the important part is that both he and Sebastian are in custody for attempting to murder you. Justice is coming, slowly but definitely. Thomas squeezed her hand weakly. Good, now can we please have a normal life? Maybe go back to when I was a carpenter and you were a maid and our biggest problem was affording rent. Clara laughed through tears. I wish we could, but we're stuck with billions of euros, and the responsibility to use them well, Henry didn't give us the option of normal. But maybe we can create a new normal that includes justice, compassion, and the occasional attempted murder by entitled rich people. Her husband smiled despite obvious pain. Sounds perfect. When do we start? As Clara sat beside Thomas's hospital bed, Edmund coordinating legal proceedings, Sarah providing maternal support, and Mrs. Pemberton ensuring the manor remained secure, Clara understood that the Whitmore family's final gambit had failed, but at terrible cost. Thomas would recover, eventually, but the scars would remain, both physical and psychological, permanent reminders of what wealth could cost. Was it worth it? Sarah asked later, voicing the question everyone was thinking. Clara looked at her husband sleeping peacefully for the first time since the attack, at her mother who'd become unexpected ally, at the fortune that had brought nothing but trouble, at the legacy she'd inherited from people she'd never met. Ask me in 50 years, she replied, when we've had time to see whether Catherine's values and Henry's guilt combined to create something worth the pain it took to claim it. But even as exhaustion finally claimed her, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that Marcus's parting words carried truth, that the Whitmore family had more resources than she'd anticipated, and that this victory was just one battle in a war that might never truly end. What other weapons did the Whitmores possess? What allies remained hidden? And would Clara survive long enough to prove that sometimes, against all odds, good could triumph over entitled evil? Have you ever discovered that the enemy you thought you'd defeated was merely the visible tip of a much larger, more dangerous iceberg? Clara sat in Henry's study 3 weeks after Marcus and Sebastian's arrests, Thomas finally home from the hospital, but still recovering, when Edmund arrived unannounced with a metal briefcase handcuffed to his wrist and an expression that suggested the nightmare was far from over. "We have a problem," the lawyer announced without preamble, setting the briefcase on the desk with deliberate care. A significant problem that explains why Marcus seemed so confident even while being arrested, and why Victoria's been suspiciously quiet since her brother's incarceration. Thomas, still moving carefully with healing ribs, joined them from his wheelchair that he'd need for another month until his pelvis fully mended. His presence both comfort and reminder of what the Whitmores had already cost. "What kind of problem?" Clara asked, dreading the answer. Edmund unlocked the briefcase, revealing files marked with international banking logos, corporate registrations from jurisdictions Clara had never heard of, and photographs of men in expensive suits whose faces suggested they were accustomed to operating beyond legal oversight. After Marcus's arrest, I hired a team of international investigators to trace Whitmore family assets, concerned they might try to hide money to avoid civil judgments, Edmund explained, spreading documents across the desk with methodical precision. What they found suggests the Whitmore family's corruption extends far beyond corporate fraud and attempted murder. He pulled out an organizational chart showing connections spanning 3 continents. The Whitmore family has been laundering money through offshore accounts for 30 years, partnering with individuals connected to organized crime in Russia, corruption in Southeast Asia, and arms dealing in Eastern Europe. We're not talking about tax avoidance, Clara. We're talking about facilitating international criminal enterprises. Clara felt the floor drop away beneath her, the implications cascading through her understanding of what she'd inherited. Henry's fortune, the money he left me, is it connected to this? Some of it, yes, Edmund confirmed grimly. Approximately 15% of the Whitmore Empire's value comes from investments that were originally funded with laundered money. Henry may not have known the full extent initially, but evidence suggests he discovered it around the same time he learned about Marcus and Victoria's fraud. Thomas leaned forward despite obvious pain. That's why he documented everything. He realized his family wasn't just greedy, but criminally connected to dangerous people, and by leaving everything to Clara, he was trying to extract the fortune from their influence. Edmund nodded, pulling out more documents. But extraction isn't simple when you're dealing with international criminals who consider the Whitmore accounts their property. These aren't people who accept losing access to billions in laundered assets just because an old man changed his will. Clara's hands trembled as she examined photographs of men whose eyes carried the flat effect of people who'd killed without remorse. "You're saying that by inheriting Henry's fortune, I've made enemies of organized crime?" "Not just any organized crime," Edmund clarified, his voice heavy. "Specifically the Volkov bratva out of Moscow, the Chang Syndicate in Hong Kong, and various smaller operations that used Whitmore Industries as a washing machine for dirty money. They've been very patient waiting for Henry to die and expecting Victoria or Marcus to maintain the arrangement. He laid out financial records showing regular transfers, coded communications, and meetings between Whitmore family members and individuals who were definitely not legitimate business associates. Victoria has been the primary liaison, Edmund continued, indicating travel records and communications. She's visited Moscow 6 times in the past 3 years, always staying at properties owned by Dmitry Volkov, and her bank accounts show deposits that don't correspond to any legitimate income source. Clara thought of Victoria slapping her in the corridor, calling her a thief, the entitled rage of someone whose crimes extended far beyond simple greed. So Victoria is not just angry about inheritance, she's terrified that I'll discover these connections and expose her relationship with international criminals? Worse, Edmund replied. She's terrified that you'll cut off access to the laundering infrastructure, costing her criminal partners billions in untraceable funds, and those partners are not known for accepting such losses gracefully. Thomas absorbed this, his carpenter's pragmatism cutting through complexity. So what you're telling us is that even with Marcus and Sebastian in jail, the real threat comes from international criminals who want their money laundering operation back. Exactly, Edmund confirmed, and they have resources that make the Whitmore family's wealth look insignificant: private armies, political connections in countries where law means nothing, and absolutely no moral constraints about how they achieve their objectives. Clara stood, pacing the study that had once been Henry's sanctuary, but now felt like a command center in a war she hadn't known she was fighting. Did Henry leave information about how to handle this? He documented everything else. Surely he considered what would happen when these people lost access to their laundering network. Edmund pulled out a sealed letter from the briefcase's inner pocket, Henry's handwriting across the envelope. For Clara, when she discovers the full truth. Clara broke the seal with shaking hands, reading Henry's final message. My dearest Clara, if you're reading this, then you've learned that my empire was built partially on blood money, and I've left you not just wealth but war with people who make my family's cruelty look like playground squabbles. I'm sorry for this burden, truly, but I saw no other way to extract our fortune from their control. The letter continued with devastating honesty. I spent 5 years secretly working with international law enforcement, documenting the money laundering operations, building cases against everyone involved, including my own daughter. Everything you need to destroy their infrastructure is in my hidden safe, the same one where you found Catherine's story. Behind the false back is another compartment containing evidence that will bring down criminal empires spanning 3 continents. Clara looked up from the letter. There's another compartment in the safe? Edmund nodded. I discovered it yesterday, triggered by a sequence of presses on specific points in the safe's interior. Henry was extraordinarily careful about security. And inside is a digital archive containing 30 years of financial crimes, names, dates, transactions, everything needed for prosecution. Thomas looked between them. So Henry's plan was for Clara to inherit the fortune, discover the criminal connections, and then use his evidence to destroy the money laundering network, essentially weaponizing his estate against the criminals who'd corrupted it? That's exactly his plan, Edmund confirmed, but executing it means making permanent enemies of people who've killed for far less provocation. Clara, I need you to understand what cooperating with law enforcement means in practical terms. These organizations will put contracts on your life. They'll target everyone you love, and they have patience measured in decades. Clara returned to Henry's letter, finding instructions. I've already provided copies of this evidence to Interpol, the FBI, and MI6 under sealed warrant that activates upon my death. They're waiting for you to authorize full disclosure and cooperation. But Clara, you must choose this consciously, because once you agree, there's no going back. You'll be under protection for years, possibly forever, and the Whitmore name will be forever associated with the criminal enterprises we enabled. The letter concluded with an apology and a challenge. I'm sorry for giving you this impossible choice, but I couldn't die knowing that money I'd earned was facilitating human trafficking, arms dealing, and worse. I chose cowardice with Catherine 50 years ago. But I'm trying to choose courage through you now. Be stronger than I was, Clara, be better, and perhaps together we can prove that redemption is possible even for fortunes built on blood. Sarah entered the study, apparently summoned by Mrs. Pemberton, who'd been monitoring from the doorway, and read the situation accurately from everyone's expressions. What's happened now? What new nightmare have the Whitmores unleashed? Clara handed her mother the letter and evidence, watching Sarah's face transform from concern to horror as she absorbed the scope of what Henry had hidden. So my daughter has inherited not just money, but a target on her back from Russian mobsters and international criminals? Sarah's voice rose with each word. This is beyond anything reasonable, Clara. You need to give this fortune back, tell law enforcement to handle their own investigations, and disappear before these people kill you like they tried to kill Thomas. But Clara shook her head, a strange calm settling over her despite the terror underneath. Mom, if I walk away, Victoria maintains the laundering infrastructure. Criminals continue using Whitmore resources to facilitate trafficking and violence, and Henry's attempt at redemption becomes meaningless. I can't do that, not when I have the power to stop it. Thomas wheeled closer, taking her hand. Clara, I support you always, but your mother has a point. These aren't corporate executives we can outsmart or entitled rich people we can expose. These are professional killers who've built empires on violence. How do we fight that? Edmund cleared his throat. Actually, we don't fight them directly. We work with international law enforcement who've been building cases for years, but lack the financial documentation Henry provided. His evidence exposes bank accounts, shell companies, and transactions that prove money laundering across multiple jurisdictions. With that documentation, authorities can freeze assets, arrest operators, and essentially dismantle the entire network simultaneously. He pulled out communications from various agencies. Interpol has been waiting for authorization to act. They have teams ready in 12 countries, hundreds of warrants prepared, and coordination with local authorities who'll execute arrests simultaneously to prevent anyone escaping or destroying evidence. They just need Clara's permission and cooperation to proceed. Clara looked at the arrest warrants bearing names she'd seen in Henry's documentation. Dmitry Volkov, Chong Wei, Marcus Whitmore, Victoria Whitmore, and dozens of others whose crimes ranged from money laundering to human trafficking to arms dealing. If I authorize this operation, what happens to me? Do I just go back to normal life afterward? An Interpol agent named Director James Rousseau entered, apparently coordinating with Edmund, his presence suggesting this decision had been anticipated. Mrs. Bennett, I'm Director Rousseau from Interpol's Financial Crimes Division. I've been working with Mr. Cross regarding the Whitmore evidence, and I need to be honest with you about consequences. He sat across from Clara, his expression carrying the weariness of someone who'd seen too much human evil. If you authorize this operation, we execute arrests simultaneously across 12 countries, freeze approximately 8 billion euros in criminal assets, and effectively destroy 3 major international criminal networks. It will be the largest coordinated action against organized crime in European history. Clara absorbed the scale. But some operators will escape initial arrests, and those individuals will blame you personally for destroying their empires. Rousseau continued bluntly. We'll provide protection, relocate you if necessary, monitor threats continuously, but I cannot guarantee your absolute safety. These organizations have reached people in witness protection before, and they hold grudges measured in lifetimes. Sarah's voice broke. You're asking my daughter to risk her life, her husband's life, possibly mine, to clean up a mess created by people who've been dead or imprisoned. How is that fair? Rousseau's expression softened. It's not fair, Mrs. Morrison. None of this is fair, but fairness isn't the issue. Stopping human trafficking networks that enslave thousands, arms dealers who fuel conflicts killing tens of thousands, and corruption destroying entire economies. That's the issue, and your daughter has evidence that makes stopping them possible. Thomas spoke quietly. Clara, I almost died because Sebastian was desperate and violent. If we do this, we're making enemies of people who make Sebastian look like an amateur. Are we ready for that? Clara thought of Catherine, who'd loved Henry but released him, built a life despite heartbreak, survived with dignity intact, and wondered what her grandmother would counsel in this impossible situation. What would Henry do? She asked Edmund, seeking guidance from a dead man who'd created this crisis. The lawyer considered carefully. Henry spent his final years documenting crimes he'd enabled through cowardice and complicity. He chose cooperation with law enforcement, knowing it would destroy his family's reputation and endanger anyone who inherited his estate. So yes, I think Henry would want you to authorize this operation. But he'd also understand if you refused. Courage isn't required, Clara, it's just hoped for. Mrs. Pemberton spoke from the doorway, her stern face showing rare vulnerability. I've worked for the Whitmore family for 40 years. watched them evolve from merely greedy to actively criminal, and I'll tell you what Henry told me 6 months before he died. I can't undo the harm I've enabled, but perhaps someone braver than me can stop future harm. He meant you, Clara. He believed you'd be strong enough to do what he couldn't. Clara looked around the study at people who'd become family through crisis rather than blood. Edmund, who'd protected her legally, David and Margaret, who'd risked careers exposing corporate fraud. Mrs. Pemberton, who'd provided wisdom and support. Her mother, who'd defended her daughter despite reasonable terror. And Thomas, who'd nearly died simply for being married to her. If I say yes, everyone in this room becomes a target, she stated, needing them to understand consequences. These organizations will investigate anyone close to me, looking for leverage or vulnerability. You need to choose consciously whether you're willing to accept that risk. Edmund spoke first. I'm already involved. My name is on legal documents. I've met with law enforcement. Refusing now doesn't make me safer. So yes, I'm with you. David's voice came through speakerphone, patched in from corporate headquarters. I wore a wire to catch Sebastian, knowing it was dangerous. This is just a larger scale of the same fight. Count me in. Margaret added her support. I've spent my career watching criminals hide behind corporate legitimacy. The chance to actually stop them rather than just documenting their crimes. Yes, absolutely. Mrs. Pemberton's agreement was simple. Catherine would be proud of this choice, and Henry's betting his entire legacy that you'd make it. I'm too old to start being cowardly now. Sarah remained silent longest, her mother's instinct warring with recognition that her daughter had already decided. I hate this. I hate that you're even considering it, but I understand why, so yes, if you're doing this suicidally brave thing, then I'm staying beside you to drag you back from the edge when necessary. Thomas squeezed Clara's hand, his support needing no words. Clara turned to Director Rousseau. What's the timeline? If I authorize this operation, when does it happen? We can execute within 72 hours, the Interpol director replied. Teams are already positioned, warrants are prepared, we're just waiting for your authorization and cooperation. Henry's documentation is comprehensive, but your testimony as the estate's inheritor strengthens prosecution significantly. Clara stood, moving to the window overlooking gardens where Catherine and Henry had once dreamed of a future that couldn't exist, and wondered if they were watching now. If somehow they knew that their tragic romance had led to this moment of impossible choice. Tell me about the people we'd be stopping, she said, needing to understand what she was fighting for beyond abstract justice. Rousseau pulled out files, opening them to reveal photographs and descriptions that made Clara's stomach turn. The Volkov-Bratva controls trafficking networks that enslave approximately 15,000 women annually. The Chang Syndicate moves illegal weapons that fuel conflicts across Africa and Southeast Asia, and the smaller operations connected to Whitmore. Laundering facilitate everything from drug distribution to contract killing. Your evidence exposes their financial infrastructure, and without money, these operations collapse. He showed Clara surveillance photos of young women in cages, children forced into labor, families destroyed by violence enabled by the weapons these criminals sold. Every day we delay is another day these organizations operate, another day people suffer, another day criminals believe they're untouchable. Henry understood this, which is why he risked everything documenting their crimes. Clara felt anger replacing fear. A righteous fury at people who'd turned human suffering into profit and hidden behind corporate legitimacy. How does the operation work? Walk me through what happens when I say yes. Rousseau laid out a map showing 12 countries with red pins marking arrest locations. At exactly 0300 Central European Time, teams execute simultaneous raids in Moscow, Hong Kong, London, Geneva, Dubai, Singapore, and 6 other cities. We arrest approximately 200 individuals, freeze €8 billion in assets, and seize documentation from their offices before they can destroy evidence. He showed tactical plans displaying the coordination required. In London specifically, we arrest Victoria Whitmore at her residence, execute search warrants on properties owned by Whitmore family members, and secure documentation from Whitmore Industries offices. Edmund has identified the specific accounts and transactions to target, making the financial case airtight. Clara imagined Victoria's face when agents arrived. The entitled shock of someone who'd believed wealth made her untouchable. And afterward, assuming the operation succeeds, what happens to me? You'll testify at multiple trials over approximately 2 years, Rousseau explained. We'll provide security during testimony, safe houses between appearances, and eventually relocation if threat assessment suggests you can't safely return to normal life. It's disruptive, stressful, and dangerous, but it's also how we stop people who believe they're above the law. Thomas looked at Clara, his expression mixing love and concern. 2 years of testimony, safe houses, and protection detail. That's not a life, Clara. That's imprisonment with better security. But Clara thought of the photographs Rousseau had shown, of victims whose suffering was enabled by money flowing through accounts Henry had created and Victoria had maintained. It's temporary imprisonment to stop permanent evil, Thomas. And isn't that worth some disruption to our comfortable life? Her husband studied her face, apparently finding what he needed. Then we do it together. They'll have to protect me anyway as your husband. So we face this as a team. Sarah closed her eyes, acceptance and resignation warring across her features. When you were little, you'd find injured birds and insist on nursing them back to health. Spent hours with creatures that would probably die anyway because you couldn't stand to ignore suffering you had power to address. I see that same compulsion now, just with much higher stakes. She opened her eyes, tears flowing. I'm terrified, Clara, absolutely terrified, but I'm also proud, because you're choosing to be better than the people who've hurt you. And that's what Catherine would do, what she did do when she chose to build a beautiful life rather than let heartbreak destroy her. Clara embraced her mother, feeling 3 generations of strength flowing through that connection. So we're doing this? She asked the room, final confirmation before committing to a path with no retreat. The assembled group nodded, verbal confirmations overlapping, everyone understanding they were choosing danger over comfort, justice over safety, integrity over self-preservation. Clara turned to Director Rousseau. I authorize the operation, use Henry's evidence, freeze the accounts, arrest everyone involved, and I'll testify at every trial necessary to ensure convictions. The Whitmore fortune stops facilitating evil today. Rousseau stood, shaking Clara's hand formally. Thank you, Mrs. Bennet. You're making the right choice, the brave choice, and thousands of people who'll never know your name will live better lives because of your courage. He pulled out authorization documents. I need your signature here, here, and here, confirming voluntary cooperation and authorization to use evidence from the Whitmore estate. Once signed, the operation proceeds, and there's no turning back. Clara read the documents carefully, each line representing commitment to years of testimony, disruption, and danger, but also representing the possibility of stopping suffering she had power to prevent. She signed with steady hand, her signature transforming. From Clara Bennet to someone who'd chosen to fight evil despite personal cost. It's done, she said, the words feeling final and irrevocable. Rousseau collected the documents. The operation executes in 72 hours. I suggest you prepare for immediate relocation after arrests. We'll move you to a secure facility while initial prosecutions proceed, and you'll be briefed on security protocols tomorrow. After the Interpol director left, the study fell silent except for the grandfather clock marking time toward an operation that would change everything. We just declared war on international organized crime, Thomas said, the statement hanging between disbelief and reality. Clara looked at Henry's portrait, the stern face of a man who'd spent 50 years making wrong choices before finally trying to make one right choice through someone he hoped was braver than himself. No, Henry declared war by documenting their crimes. We're just finishing what he started, honoring Catherine's memory by using wealth more ethically than the people who'd accumulated it, proving that sometimes, against impossible odds, good people can triumph over evil ones. Mrs. Pemberton brought tea, the ritual providing normalcy against gathering chaos. You've made your grandmother proud, your husband nearly died protecting you, and now you're both choosing to risk everything for people you'll never meet. If that's not love in action, then I don't know what is. Sarah sipped her tea, hands trembling slightly. So for the next 72 hours we just wait? Knowing that in 3 days, international raids happen and our lives change forever. Edmund nodded. We prepare, we review security protocols, and we wait. I've arranged for Thomas's medical care to transfer to the secure facility. Mrs. Pemberton will oversee packing essentials, and Clara should prepare testimony about her knowledge of the estate and its connections to laundering operations. The practical considerations provided focus, turning abstract danger into concrete tasks that could be managed. Over the next 3 days, Clara reviewed decades of financial crimes with Interpol analysts, memorized names and transactions she'd need to recall during testimony, and coordinated with prosecutors across 12 jurisdictions who'd each need her cooperation. Thomas continued physical therapy with security watching, his recovery complicated by knowing that in days they'd relocate to an undisclosed facility where normal life became impossible. Sarah dealt with the practical impossibility of closing her life temporarily, arranging for her cottage to be maintained, her affairs managed, and preparing for indefinite separation from everything familiar. Mrs. Pemberton supervised packing with military efficiency, selecting what could accompany them to secure facilities and what must stay behind, each choice representing another severing of connection to normal existence. The night before the operation, Clara stood in Catherine's garden, the roses blooming despite the gathering storm, and felt her grandmother's presence like a benediction. "I hope I'm doing what you'd want," she whispered to memory and moonlight, using this fortune to stop suffering rather than accumulate comfort, choosing courage over safety, being better than the people who'd failed before me. Thomas joined her, walking now without wheelchair though his limp remained. "Having second thoughts?" Clara leaned into his solid warmth. "Constant second thoughts, but I keep returning to those photographs Rousseau showed me, the victims of trafficking and violence enabled by money flowing through accounts I now control. How do I ignore that? How do I choose comfortable ignorance over uncomfortable action?" Her husband had no answer except presence, and they stood together as midnight approached, marking the beginning of Operation Day. At 3 a.m. Central European Time, in 12 countries simultaneously, hundreds of law enforcement agents executed raids with military precision, arresting criminals who'd believed wealth made them untouchable, freezing billions in laundered assets, and beginning prosecution of networks that had operated with impunity for decades. In London, Victoria Whitmore was arrested in her Belgrave Square residence, her entitled shock at handcuffs and charges captured by surveillance that would become evidence. Marcus and Sebastian, already in custody, found their charges expanded from attempted murder to include money laundering, racketeering, and conspiracy to facilitate human trafficking. In Moscow, Hong Kong, Dubai, and 9 other cities, similar arrests happened with coordinated timing that prevented warnings or escape, each criminal learning simultaneously that their empire had collapsed. Clara watched news coverage from the secure facility where she'd been relocated, seeing her decision transform into reality. 3 decades of criminal enterprise dismantled in hours because one old man had documented everything and one young woman had chosen courage over safety. "They're calling it the largest coordinated action against organized crime in history," Edmund reported, monitoring international news. "Approximately 200 arrests, $8 billion in frozen assets, and enough evidence to support prosecutions for years. You did this, Clara, you and Henry together." But Clara felt no triumph, only exhausted relief that the operation had succeeded, mixed with anxiety about what came next. "Now we wait for trials to begin," she said, "and hope that the people who escaped don't decide revenge is worth pursuing." Thomas held her hand, his touch anchoring her to purpose. "They'll try, but we're protected, we're together, and we're fighting for something that matters. Whatever comes next, we face it knowing we chose right over easy." As dawn broke over a world slightly less corrupt than the day before, Clara thought of Catherine and Henry, of love that couldn't overcome class barriers, but had somehow led to justice for thousands of victims, of choices made and consequences accepted, of ordinary people doing extraordinary things because someone had to. "Henry was right to choose you," Mrs. Pemberton said, joining them at the secure facility's window overlooking landscape they couldn't identify. Catherine would be proud, and somewhere, somehow, they're both watching this knowing their tragedy led to something beautiful. But in a Moscow prison cell, Dmitry Volkov placed a single phone call using privileges that money still purchased. And on the other end, someone listened carefully to instructions about a woman who'd cost him billions and would pay for that audacity with everything she loved. The war had begun, but Clara Bennett née Morrison, granddaughter of a maid who'd loved a billionaire, inheritor of guilt and fortune, had chosen her side, and whatever came next, she'd face it knowing that sometimes the price of integrity is everything, and sometimes that price is worth paying. What revenge would criminals plan against the woman who'd destroyed their empires? How long would Clara survive as the target of international criminal organizations? And would the justice she'd chosen ultimately cost more than the suffering she'd prevented? Clara stood in a Geneva courtroom 18 months after the coordinated raids, her testimony in the trial of Dmitry Volkov entering its 3rd day, when the Russian crime lord smiled at her from the defendant's table with an expression that promised her victory would be temporary and his revenge eternal. "Mrs. Bennett," the prosecutor prompted gently, redirecting her attention from Volkov's intimidation. "Can you identify the signature on this transfer authorization?" Clara examined the document projected on courtroom screens. Recognizing Victoria's handwriting authorizing movement of 12 million euros through accounts designed to obscure origin and destination. "That's Victoria Whitmore's signature. I've seen it on hundreds of documents since inheriting the estate, and the account number matches one of the shell companies Henry documented as part of the laundering network." The prosecutor nodded, adding the document to evidence that had accumulated over months of testimony. "And to your knowledge, did Victoria Whitmore understand these transfers facilitated criminal enterprises?" "Yes," Clara replied firmly, meeting Volkov's stare without flinching. Henry's documentation includes emails where Victoria explicitly discusses cleaning money for Eastern partners, and she received payments totaling approximately 8 million euros over 5 years for maintaining the infrastructure. Volkov's lawyer objected predictably, arguing hearsay and speculation, but the judge overruled, allowing Clara's testimony to stand alongside the documentary evidence that had already convicted dozens of lesser operators. "No further questions," the prosecutor concluded, and Clara stepped down, flanked immediately by security agents who'd become constant shadows over 18 months of testimony. Thomas waited in the witness gallery, his limp now barely noticeable though pain still etched his features during weather changes, his carpenter's hands scarred from accident and recovery, but still capable of holding Clara's with reassuring strength. "How much longer?" he asked quietly as they exited through secure corridors designed to prevent exactly the kind of retaliation Volkov had promised. "This is the last major trial," Edmund reported, joining them with updates. "Volkov's conviction is essentially guaranteed given the evidence, and with his testimony, we can connect the final pieces to the Chang syndicate. After that, the primary prosecutions are complete." Clara felt exhausted relief mixed with lingering anxiety. "But there are still operators who escaped, people who blame me for destroying their networks. When does it actually end?" Her lawyer's expression suggested the answer she dreaded. "Realistically? Never completely. You've made permanent enemies of organizations that measure grudges in generations. But the active threat diminishes significantly once primary leadership is imprisoned or dead. Another year perhaps, maybe 2. They emerged into Geneva's afternoon sunlight, the city beautiful and indifferent to the dramas playing out in its courtrooms, and Clara felt the weight of 18 months in protective custody, 18 months of testimony and security protocols, and suspended life. Sarah met them at the secure vehicle, her face showing strain of similar confinement. A woman in her 60s who'd expected quiet retirement, but instead got international intrigue and constant vigilance. "How did it go?" her mother asked, embracing Clara with fierce protectiveness that hadn't diminished despite repetition. "Volkov will be convicted, probably sentenced to 30 years minimum, and his organization is effectively dismantled," Clara reported. "But he looked at me like he was memorizing my face for future reference, and I don't think prison walls will stop him from trying something eventually." Mrs. Pemberton, who'd insisted on accompanying them through 18 months of testimony and relocation, added her assessment. "Men like Volkov never forgive, but they also operate pragmatically. Once you're no longer strategically important to target, the threat diminishes to manageable background risk, unpleasant but survivable." The secure facility they'd called home for 18 months appeared on the horizon, a converted estate outside Geneva that provided both comfort and security, though Clara would trade all the luxury for the freedom to walk streets without escorts or visit cafes without threat assessment. David and Margaret joined them for dinner via secure video link, their faces showing strain of managing Whitmore Industries through 18 months of scandal and restructuring. "The company's stabilizing," Margaret reported, her CFO precision applying to recovery. "We've divested all assets connected to laundering operations, implemented compliance systems that would make a monastery look corrupt, and rebuilt our reputation through aggressive ethical positioning. It's been expensive and exhausting, but we're emerging as potentially the cleanest major corporation in Europe." David added strategic updates. "The sustainability initiatives are attracting positive attention. Investors who care about ethics over maximum returns are investing heavily, and we're positioned to become industry leaders in responsible business practices. Henry would be proud of what you've built from his wreckage." Clara felt satisfaction mixed with irony. "We took a fortune built partially on blood money and transformed it into something that actually helps people. Is that redemption or just expensive public relations?" Thomas squeezed her hand. "It's both," And it's also honoring Catherine's values by proving that wealth can serve character rather than corrupting it. That's what Henry hoped for, and you've exceeded those hopes despite impossible circumstances. After dinner, Clara walked the secure facility's grounds with Thomas, their evening ritual providing normalcy against the abnormal existence they'd accepted. "Do you regret it?" she asked, the question that haunted quiet moments. "Choosing me, supporting these decisions, nearly dying and then spending 18 months in protective custody because your wife inherited a cursed fortune?" Thomas stopped walking, turning to face her directly. "Clara, I fell in love with a maid who treated people with dignity regardless of their position, who saw problems and fixed them without being asked, who had integrity that wealth couldn't corrupt. That person is still who you are, maybe even more so after everything we've survived." He pulled her close, his carpenter's strength still capable of making her feel safe despite everything. "The fortune brought suffering, yes, but it also gave us power to stop trafficking. Networks, arrest arms dealers, and dismantle criminal enterprises. How many lives were saved because you chose courage over comfort? Thousands? Tens of thousands? That matters, Clara. That makes the suffering worth it." Clara leaned into him, drawing strength from his unwavering support. "I keep thinking about Catherine and Henry, how their love couldn't survive class barriers but somehow led to all this. Does that make their tragedy meaningful, or does it just prove that 50 years of regret can't actually fix past mistakes?" "Maybe it proves that love transcends the people who feel it," Thomas suggested. "Catherine and Henry couldn't be together, but their story gave you the inheritance that stopped criminals and helped victims. Their personal tragedy became collective victory, and I think they'd both accept that trade." A security alert interrupted the moment, agents moving with sudden urgency that sent Clara's heart racing. "What's happening?" Edmund appeared, phone pressed to ear, his expression grim. "Volkov escaped during transport back to detention, killed 2 guards, and disappeared somewhere in Geneva's old city. Interpol is coordinating search. But Clara, we need to relocate you immediately. He's made threats suggesting you're his target." The carefully constructed security collapsed into chaos, agents rushing Clara and Thomas to armored vehicles while Sarah and Mrs. Pemberton were secured separately. The plan they'd rehearsed monthly suddenly horrifyingly real. "How did he escape?" Clara demanded, being rushed toward waiting vehicles. "He was supposed to be in maximum security transport with full escort." Director Rousseau's voice came through secure communications. "Someone inside his organization paid for assistance. We're investigating how deep the corruption goes. But right now the priority is keeping you alive until we recapture him." The armored vehicle raced through Geneva streets. Destination unknown even to Clara, security protocols keeping location information compartmentalized to prevent leaks. Thomas held her hand tightly, his presence the only constant in a world that had suddenly tilted toward nightmare. "He won't get to you," her husband promised, though his expression suggested he was trying to convince himself as much as Clara. "Security is too tight, escape was desperate move, and he'll be captured within hours." But hours became days, and Volkov remained free despite international manhunt, his organization's resources apparently sufficient to keep him hidden while he planned whatever revenge had motivated his escape. Clara existed in a state of suspended terror, relocated every 12 hours to new secure facilities, never knowing where she'd wake or who might be compromised, trusting strangers with her life because the alternative was accepting that Volkov would eventually succeed. On the 4th day, Interpol intercepted communications suggesting Volkov planned to attack during Clara's next testimony, scheduled in 3 days at the International Criminal Court in The Hague. "We can postpone," Rousseau suggested during secure briefing. "Delay your testimony until Volkov is recaptured. No one expects you to walk into a courtroom knowing there's an active threat." But Clara shook her head, surprising herself with sudden clarity. "That's exactly what he wants, to make me too afraid to testify, to show that violence works, that intimidation succeeds. If I postpone, then every other witness becomes a target, and the entire prosecution strategy collapses." Edmund objected immediately. "Clara, Volkov killed 2 trained guards during his escape. He's desperate, dangerous, and specifically targeting you. Testifying is essentially volunteering as bait." "Then make sure the trap works," Clara replied, her voice steady despite fear churning beneath. "Use me as bait if necessary, but ensure Volkov is captured when he makes his attempt. End this permanently, so we can finally start living again." Thomas looked torn between pride and terror. "You're absolutely certain? Because once we commit to this plan, there's no safe retreat. Volkov will either be captured or he'll kill you trying." Clara thought of Catherine, who'd survived heartbreak and built beautiful life through sheer determination, of Henry, who'd spent 50 years trying to atone for cowardice, of thousands of trafficking victims saved by prosecutions her testimony enabled. I'm certain we finish what we started, honor everyone who's sacrificed for this justice, and prove that evil doesn't win just because it's willing to kill. Over the next 3 days, Interpol and international security services constructed elaborate defenses around the Hague courthouse, positioning snipers, installing detection equipment, and coordinating hundreds of agents in preparation for testimony that had become operational focal point. Clara reviewed her testimony with prosecutors, memorizing details that would connect Volkov to trafficking networks, document his organization's structure, and provide evidence supporting decades of imprisonment. You understand the risk? Rousseau asked the night before testimony, his weariness suggesting he'd argued against this plan. We've done everything possible to secure the courthouse, but Volkov's organization has resources and determination. If they've planned something we haven't anticipated, you could die tomorrow. Clara nodded, accepting mortality with strange calm. I understand, but I also understand that hiding from evil is how it wins. Catherine didn't hide from heartbreak, she survived it. Henry didn't hide from his crimes, he documented them. And I won't hide from Volkov's threats, I'll face them. Sarah held her daughter close that night, both women aware this might be final embrace. You're the bravest person I've ever known, her mother whispered. Braver than Catherine, braver than me, braver than anyone should have to be, and I'm terrified I'm going to lose you. Clara pulled back, meeting her mother's eyes. Mum, if something happens tomorrow, I need you to know that every choice was mine, every risk consciously accepted, and I'd make the same choices again because they were right. Don't let grief convince you that courage was stupidity. Mrs. Pemberton added her blessing. Catherine would be proud beyond words. Henry's redemption is complete through you. And whatever happens tomorrow, you've already won by refusing to let evil intimidate you into silence. The Hague courthouse appeared like a fortress when Clara arrived at dawn, security so pervasive that normal business had been suspended. Her testimony the only proceeding scheduled, hundreds of people deployed to protect one woman's right to speak truth. Clara walked through metal detectors and security screening, each layer another barrier between her and danger, until finally she entered the courtroom where judges, prosecutors, and heavily armed security waited. Volkov's defense team sat at their table, but the defendant's chair remained conspicuously empty, his escape having paused trial until today's testimony would proceed in absentia. Mrs. Bennett, please take the stand, the presiding judge instructed, her voice carrying authority earned through decades of international justice. Clara swore to tell truth, the oath feeling weighted with significance beyond legal formality, and began testimony that detailed Volkov's organization with precision that only Henry's documentation made possible. The Volkov Bratva operated trafficking networks in 14 countries, she explained, referencing documents projected on screens, moving approximately 15,000 women annually, with Victoria Whitmore's assistance in laundering proceeds totaling approximately €200 million over 8 years. The prosecution guided her through evidence methodically, each document another piece of comprehensive case that would ensure Volkov's conviction despite his absence. 2 hours into testimony, alarms suddenly screamed throughout the courthouse, security agents moving with practiced urgency, and Clara understood that Volkov's attempt was happening, that the trap was sprung, that the next moments would determine whether courage or violence triumphed. Get down, an agent shouted, throwing Clara to the floor as gunfire erupted from somewhere outside the courtroom, the sound of automatic weapons unmistakable and terrifying. Thomas, watching from gallery, tried to reach her but was restrained by security, his voice calling her name lost in chaos of alarms and shouting and more gunfire. Clara pressed against the courtroom floor, agents surrounding her in human shield, and heard through her fear the sounds of battle between security forces and whoever Volkov had sent to silence her. Minutes stretched like hours until sudden silence fell, broken only by alarms still wailing their mechanical warning. All clear, someone announced, and agents helped Clara to her feet, shaken but unharmed, the courtroom damaged by gunfire but secure. Director Rousseau entered, his expression mixing relief and satisfaction. Volkov and 3 accomplices attempted to breach courthouse security. They were engaged by our forces in the parking structure. Volkov is dead, the others captured. The threat is over, Clara, it's finally over. Clara felt no triumph, only exhausted relief that the 18 months of testimony, fear, and suspended life had finally reached conclusion. He's really dead? You're certain? Rousseau showed her phone photographs of Volkov's body, the Russian crime lord's face frozen in final expression of fury and surprise. He's dead. His organization is destroyed, and with today's incident, remaining operators understand that attacking witnesses brings complete law enforcement response. You're safe, Clara, genuinely safe for the first time since you authorized the operation. Thomas reached her, embracing so tightly that her ribs protested, his tears mixing with hers as 18 months of tension finally released. It's over, he kept repeating. Actually over, we survived, you survived, we can finally live again. The trial resumed after brief recess, Clara completing her testimony with voice growing stronger. Knowing that Volkov's death meant his organization's complete collapse, that thousands of victims would never face the trafficking he'd enabled, that justice had prevailed despite everything. No further questions, the prosecutor concluded, and Clara stepped down, testimony complete, her role in the prosecution's finally finished. The drive back to their secure facility felt different, lighter somehow, despite the day's violence, because the threat that had haunted 18 months had been permanently eliminated. What happens now? Clara asked Edmund, barely daring to hope. The lawyer smiled, genuine warmth replacing his professional reserve. Now we go home, back to Whitmore Manor, back to London, back to actual life rather than protective custody. The estate has been maintained by Mrs. Pemberton's staff. Whitmore Industries awaits your active leadership, and you're free to live without constant security. Sarah laughed, the sound carrying 18 months of suppressed emotion. I can return to my cottage? See my friends? Have a life that doesn't involve armed guards and secure facilities. Exactly, Rousseau confirmed. Background security will continue monitoring for residual threats, but the active protection detail ends once we're satisfied remaining operators have moved on, probably within 6 months. 6 months seemed like nothing compared to 18 they'd already endured, and Clara felt possibility opening like a flower after long winter. That evening, gathered in the secure facility's common room for final time, Clara's extended family celebrated survival against odds that had often seemed impossible. To Catherine, Clara toasted, raising champagne that security had finally permitted, who survived heartbreak with dignity and taught me through example that courage means continuing despite pain. To Henry, Thomas added, who spent 50 years regretting cowardice but ultimately chose courage through you, proving that redemption is possible even for the deeply flawed. To Clara, Edmund concluded, who inherited an impossible burden and transformed it into justice for thousands of victims, who faced death threats with determination, and who proved that ordinary people can defeat evil through extraordinary courage. They drank to survival, to justice, to Catherine and Henry, whose tragic romance had somehow led to triumph over international criminal enterprises, to ordinary people making extraordinary choices because someone had to. 1 week later, Clara stood in Whitmore Manor's entrance, the same stone archway where Catherine had once worked as maid, where Henry had lived in lonely regret, where 18 months ago she'd fled toward protective custody, not knowing if she'd ever return. Welcome home, Mrs. Bennet, Mrs. Pemberton greeted, the manor maintained in perfect condition despite Clara's absence. I've prepared your rooms, Henry's study awaits, and Whitmore Industries is eager for your active leadership. Thomas navigated the familiar halls without his former limp. Recovery complete except for scars that would always mark his brush with death, his carpenter's hands ready to resume work that protective custody had interrupted. Sarah returned to her cottage with promises to visit frequently, relieved to reclaim independence while remaining close enough to support when needed. David and Margaret arrived from Whitmore Industries headquarters with updates that demonstrated the company's transformation from corrupt enterprise to ethical leader. We've become the gold standard for corporate responsibility, Margaret reported. Competitors study our compliance systems, investors seek our guidance on ethical practices, and employees express pride in working for a company that values character over profit maximization. David added strategic perspective. Revenue initially declined when we divested problematic assets, but ethical positioning has attracted so much new business that we've exceeded pre-scandal profitability. Turns out that doing the right thing can also be financially successful. Who knew? Clara felt vindication for choices that had seemed impossible 18 months earlier. So we've actually succeeded? Transformed Henry's partially corrupt fortune into something genuinely good. Edmund confirmed with legal precision. The Whitmore estate is now valued at approximately €900 million. All assets verified clean, all business practices scrutinized by independent auditors, and the Catherine Morrison Foundation is distributing $50 million annually to causes she would have supported: literacy, education access, and support for working-class families. The foundation had been Clara's first act after the raids, naming it for her grandmother and funding programs that created opportunities for people born into circumstances like Catherine's. Henry wanted redemption, Clara said, standing in his study surrounded by documentation of crimes he'd spent years exposing. And I think he achieved it, not by erasing his mistakes but by ensuring they led to something better. Thomas joined her, his presence still capable of grounding her despite everything they'd survived. So what happens next? We have fortress-level security, more money than we can spend, and presumably the rest of our lives to figure out what to do with it all. Clara pulled out the letter Catherine had written to Henry 50 years earlier, reading her grandmother's words about character mattering more than wealth. We honor her by using this fortune to create opportunities she never had. We honor Henry by demonstrating that redemption is possible through conscious choice. And we honor ourselves by building a life that matters rather than just being comfortable. She turned to face the people who'd become family through crisis. Thomas, who'd nearly died supporting her choices, Mrs. Pemberton, who'd provided wisdom when everything felt impossible, Edmund, who'd protected her legally through 18 months of testimony, David and Margaret, who'd rebuilt a corrupt company into ethical enterprise. And we do it together, as family chosen rather than inherited, proving that sometimes the best families are built from shared values rather than shared blood. Mrs. Pemberton raised a cup of tea and toast. Catherine would approve of that philosophy. She built family from bookshop customers and community members who shared her values. Blood mattered less than character in her world. Over the following months, Clara immersed herself in active leadership of Whitmore Industries, transforming from reluctant inheritor to confident CEO who valued integrity over profit and character over credentials. The company thrived under her leadership, disproving conventional wisdom that ethics and success were mutually exclusive, becoming case study taught in business schools as example of redemptive transformation. Thomas resumed carpentry, but now as director of the Catherine Morrison Foundation's housing program, building homes for working-class families who'd been priced out of traditional markets, using his skills to honor the grandmother who'd never known him but whose legacy he'd helped protect. Sarah became foundation trustee, applying a mother's wisdom to grant decisions that transformed lives through education access and opportunity creation. The Whitmore family's criminal members faced justice according to their crimes. Victoria received 18 years for money laundering and conspiracy, Marcus 15 for fraud and attempted murder conspiracy, Sebastian 12 for attempted murder and assault, their entitled lives ending in prison cells where wealth couldn't insulate them from consequences. Some days Clara walked through Catherine's gardens, maintaining the roses her grandmother had once tended when she was just a maid loving a billionaire who couldn't choose her, and felt connected to a woman she'd barely known, but whose values she'd inherited along with her appearance. "Do you think they're together now?" Thomas asked one evening as they watched sunset paint the gardens in gold and amber. Catherine and Henry, finally free from class barriers and regret? Clara considered the question seriously. "I hope so. I hope they're watching all of this knowing their tragedy led to justice for thousands of people, to ethical business practices, to opportunities for families like Catherine's. That has to count for something. That has to mean their suffering wasn't meaningless." She pulled out the locket she still wore, opening it to reveal photographs of young Catherine and young Henry, eternal and unchanging. "They gave me a choice they couldn't make for themselves, love or money, courage or comfort, and by giving me both they let me prove they're not mutually exclusive. That's their real legacy, proving that wealthy people can choose integrity, that character matters more than bank accounts, that redemption is possible even for fortunes built on blood." Thomas held her close as night fell over Whitmore Manor, over the estate, where Catherine had worked and Henry had lived, where tragedy had transformed into triumph through choices made by ordinary people who refused to accept that evil was inevitable. So was it worth it? He asked the question that would follow them forever. The near-death experiences, 18 months in protective custody, making permanent enemies of international criminals, was stopping them worth what it cost? Clara thought of photographs Rousseau had shown her, victims saved from trafficking, children rescued from forced labor, families that would never face violence enabled by weapons the Chang syndicate could no longer distribute. "Yes," she said finally, certainly. It was worth it, because some things matter more than personal comfort. Some choices must be made regardless of cost, and sometimes ordinary people have to do extraordinary things because no one else will. She looked at the manor glowing in twilight, at gardens where roses bloomed from ground Catherine had tended, at the empire Henry had built, and then tried to redeem through someone he hoped was braver than himself. Catherine survived heartbreak and built beautiful life. Henry spent 50 years in regret, but ultimately chose courage through me. And we've spent 2 years proving that their tragedy could become triumph if someone was willing to fight for it. That's what redemption looks like, messy and expensive and sometimes nearly fatal, but ultimately meaningful. As stars emerged over Whitmore Manor, Clara felt the weight of responsibility shift from burden to purpose, from inheritance to calling, from Henry's guilt to her own determination to prove that wealth could serve character rather than corrupting it. So what's next? Thomas asked, the question now carrying hope rather than dread. Clara smiled, feeling Catherine's strength and Henry's determination flowing through 3 generations. Next we live, actually live, not just surviving threats or testifying at trials, but building a life that honors everyone who made this possible. We love fiercely, work meaningfully, give generously, and prove every single day that choosing integrity over comfort was the right decision even when it's difficult. She stood, pulling Thomas up with her, ready to face whatever came next with courage inherited from a grandmother who'd survived heartbreak and wisdom learned from a benefactor who'd spent 50 years seeking redemption. And we tell their story, Clara concluded, Catherine and Henry's tragic romance that somehow led to justice for thousands, so that other people facing impossible choices might find courage knowing that sometimes love transcends the people who feel it, that character matters more than circumstances, and that redemption is possible even for the deeply flawed if they're willing to sacrifice everything for it. The manor lights blazed against gathering darkness, a beacon of hope built from tragedy, proof that ordinary people could defeat extraordinary evil through simple determination to choose right over easy, courage over comfort, character over convenience. And somewhere, perhaps, Catherine and Henry watched with eternal love finally free from earthly barriers, their tragedy transformed into triumph through a granddaughter who'd inherited more than appearance, who'd received the strength to be better than they'd been allowed to be, who'd proved that 50 years of regret could culminate in redemption if someone was brave enough to finish what they'd started. To family, Clara whispered to the stars, to memory, to everyone who'd sacrificed for justice, chosen and inherited, living and dead, flawed and striving, we honor you by living well. I'm crying. They actually survived. After everything, the corporate conspiracy, attempted murder, international crime syndicates, Volkov's escape, Clara and Thomas won. Comment below telling me your favorite moment from this entire journey. Was it when Clara exposed Blackwood? When she discovered she was Catherine's granddaughter? When she took down the Volkov Bratva? I need to know. This story proves that ordinary people can defeat extraordinary evil through courage, integrity, and refusing to give up even when the odds seem impossible. Catherine and Henry's tragic 50-year-old love story became justice for thousands of victims. If this story moved you, please hit that like button, subscribe to this channel for more incredible stories like this one, and share this with someone who needs to hear that courage matters, that character triumphs over corruption, and that redemption is possible even for the deeply flawed. Drop a comment telling me, would you have made the same choice as Clara did? Would you risk everything for justice? Your answer matters.